Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today is a special day. It's the day that I release the Chungus cut of my response to Matt Powell. Am I releasing it on a Friday so I can take a week off? Am I releasing it on another day of the week to try and pad my numbers in the almighty algorithm? Is it 2026 and I only just remembered that I even made this right after finishing the series? I don't know. You'll have to tell me. Comment down below. It's Christmas. You get a Matt Powell for Christmas. You're welcome? Yeah, no, it's crazy busy in my house this time of year, and on top of that, there's a good chance I'm going to be moving soon. So, fingers crossed that, I should find out today whether or not I'm actually moving, so fingers crossed that it goes well. Also, donate to Project Share, donate.vicerhino.com. They need your money so that they can buy food to feed hungry people, and also house unhoused people and stuff like that. So yeah, still comment down below telling me why I am releasing this now, because, engagement bait and all that. But yeah, Project Share. That's the most important part of this. But as always with my big Chungus videos, to improve the flow, I only kept the introduction from the first one, and all the comment of the day segments get smushed together at the very end. So don't mind the sudden bow tie changes, make yourself some popcorn, and sit back and relax for a nice long haul video. Or, more realistically with how YouTube promotes long videos, just go to sleep. But also, hi long haul truckers, it's mostly you and sleeping people who watch these. Okay, this intro's getting away from me, so now on to the real intro. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at another Matt Powell video. I know it's only been 2 months since I looked at his channel, and I normally give y'all a longer break from him than that, but since my last video covering him, he made a 40-minute video called A Christian Response to Evolution. I feel like this is going to be a Gish Gallop presentation of all of Matt's classic arguments, so in theory, if I respond to this video and thoroughly cover every point he makes, I'll never need to go back to his channel again, because Lord knows he doesn't ever come up with anything new. I mean, I'm still going to go back to him every now and again, because he's both hilarious and evil, so I get to loosen my reins and not try so hard to take the high road with him. He's basically creationist junk food. Fun to cover, but too much, and I start to feel sick to my stomach. Anyway, as I regularly turn 5-minute creationist videos into 45-minute responses, I am going to split this up into 4 parts rather than making one massive chungus of a video, though once I'm done I will probably be smushing them all together into said massive chungus, because I know that's how some of y'all prefer watching these sorts of things for some reason. Also, I'll be doing alternate weeks so that it isn't too much junk food in one go, so let's see what his first barrage of arguments are.
So I wanted to take some time to present the case for creationism.
And right off the bat, before he even makes any claims, we run into one of the primary problems with creationism. And that is that creationists will almost always operate under the assumption that if you can cast enough doubt onto the theory of evolution, then creationism will win by default. Wait a minute, there's a citation for that? Isn't that just my own personal observation? Well, yes indeed, there is a citation for that. While looking for the timeline of when life moved onto land for use later on in the video, I stumbled upon this peer-reviewed paper that is just delightfully pissy. It is literally a paper published in the peer-reviewed journal Evolution, Education and Outreach, which is a lengthy response to an idiot they saw in an online comments section one time. That sounds like the kind of over-the-top thing that I'd do, and I love it. To quote the paper, this altercation encapsulates perfectly a common creationist mindset, one based on cursory, and often incorrect, observations coupled with complete ignorance, or at best patchy understanding, of the scientific context framing an argument. It further relies upon a God of the Gaps argument, the belief that, in the case of unanswered questions, the proponent's personal worldview wins by default. No alternatives nor evidence supporting that proponent's perspective are required. So yeah, exactly what I'm saying here. Anyway, regarding Matt, I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but I would be willing to bet that this false dichotomy will be the basis for his entire video. If evolution is wrong, then the truth must not just be creationism, but my specific version of creationism. But that's not actually how this works. If, by some miracle, you actually manage to disprove the foundation of modern biology, then your work has just begun. You must now develop a testable model to replace it, and that model must be put to the test before it will become the accepted model. But every creationist argument I've ever seen just sort of assumes that creationism will be the default if only we can get rid of that pesky evolution. but it's just not. And that even includes a video by Eric Hovind that I've already responded to, which claimed to provide a scientific alternative to evolution. That whole video was just him doing the normal creationist thing, where he tries to cast as much doubt as he can on evolution with the assumption that creation is the default fallback position. Now, in his defense, it did end with him saying that the actual scientific replacement would be discussed in part 2, which is of course only available to people to give him money on his website. Since I am unwilling to do that, I will sadly never know what his scientific alternative to evolution is. Well, I guess I'd probably find out about it eventually if it actually were scientific, so yeah, I'm never gonna know. Back to Matt!
A lot of people think creationism is a complete myth and a fraud, but I'm here to tell you that if you actually do the research, you'll come to find that creationism is based on scientific fact.
Trust me, it's scientific. We just can't actually present any science that supports it, instead relying entirely on feeble attempts to prove other scientific things wrong. Sure, Matt.
Yeah, and so we'll just go ahead and get into this seminar here. We've got the case for creation.
Oh yeah, I forgot he's calling them seminars now. Oh, the lengths he goes to try and sound authoritative.
Creation science teaches that God created the world, and that life started on the land, life was designed by God, that dinosaurs lived recently, that the flood of Noah happened, which we call catastrophism, that mankind was designed, that the world is 6,000 years old, and that Jesus is the truth.
And since at least 4 out of 8 of those points have been thoroughly and conclusively shown to be false, we're off to a great start. And the 4 of those 8 points also happen to be the only 4 on the list that are actually scientifically testable. Like, the ones talking about life and mankind being designed are untestable. No matter how obviously not designed things can get, you can always shift the goalpost to claim that it was designed like that on purpose for whatever reason. So you can never really show scientifically that something was not designed. All you can do is point out ways in which such a design makes no sense, but that doesn't prove that it wasn't designed, simply that if it was designed badly. As to God created the world, without going into any detail about how God created the world, that's another movable goalpost. Plenty of scientists, after all, believe that God did in fact create the world, by setting up the initial parameters of the universe, pressing play, and letting things play out without further intervention. No matter how much we learn about the origin of the universe, those who want to will always be able to say that God's the one responsible, even if we get a watertight explanation for the origin of the universe that does not require or indicate any divine intervention. And as for Jesus being the truth, that's a nonsensical statement. Truth is not a person. Truth is how accurately a statement or claim describes reality. If Jesus really is who modern Christians think he is, then saying Jesus is the Son of God is a statement. If Jesus really existed and really is the Son of God, then it can be said that that statement is a true one. But this does not make Jesus the living incarnation of truth. Unless every time someone utters a true statement, that statement is itself Jesus? That also seems somewhat nonsensical. But if we treat that statement as merely being shorthand for Jesus is the Son of God, then once again it moves into the realm of mostly being untestable. There are all sorts of different ways to interpret Christianity in the Bible, so no matter what, someone who wants to believe it will always be able to find to make it work. But if you nail down your definitions better than the Romans were able to nail down Jesus, it does become testable, and I went through a bunch of reasons why I don't think the God of the Bible is real in another video that I'll leave a link to.
Evolutionists would have us believe that the world created itself.
No, the world created itself is sneaking an agent in where none is indicated by way of using the verb created, which implies a thinking agent doing the creating. Also, the use of the word world is ambiguous. Do you mean the Earth or the universe? So I would rephrase this one as the universe began. And once we take the loaded language out of it, we see that it becomes a statement that not even creationists would disagree with, and given that I already pointed out that there are scientists who believe in God, and that God is ultimately responsible for the creation of the universe, this still leaves room for God as the creator. It just renders him unnecessary.
That life began in the oceans.
Yes, the oldest fossils we have are marine. There were likely some terrestrial microbial ecosystems that existed shortly after life itself began, but the fossil record there is very sparse. Now, I could nitpick this and get into the fact that some models of abiogenesis have life beginning in more of a pond scenario, where clay that is rich with organic molecules would go through alternating cycles between being wet and being dry, leading to autocatalytic reactions that form the basis of biological metabolism, so that life didn't actually begin in the ocean, but rather in essentially mud. But What he's ultimately driving at here is the order of creation. In the Bible, God created terrestrial vegetation first, then marine animals and birds, then land animals. So ultimately, what matters is not the nitpicking about whether wet areas that experience cyclical drying count as on land or in water, but rather the fact that the fossil record clearly shows that non-microbial life went from being exclusively marine, to including terrestrial plants about 470 million years ago, to including terrestrial animals about 420 million years ago. Also, the earliest avian stem lineage goes back to the Middle Triassic, about 240 million years ago. So the idea that birds were around at the same time as the first marine animals is just, well, impossible. And those weren't even birds. That's just where the features that could develop into bird-like features started showing up. So the Bible got the order completely wrong.
That life was eroded from rocks.
Life was eroded from rocks is just a gloriously stupid misunderstanding of what is thought to have actually happened.
That dinosaurs lived 65 plus million years ago.
Congratulations, you got one right. Gold star for you, Matt. Here's a little gold star for you. Oh, it didn't stick, so, yeah. No more gold star for you, I guess.
And that uniformitarianism is true.
Uniformitarianism is the idea that geologic processes sort of even out over time and work at a slow and steady pace. And this view actually does include catastrophes. The idea is that one single hurricane probably doesn't have that big of a geologic impact, but if an area is hit by hurricanes fairly regularly over a long enough period of time, then that will have a geologic impact. This was the predominant view of the late 19th and early 20th century, but around the 1980s it started falling out of favor for what could be dubbed catastrophic uniformitarianism, which, to quote Roy Lemon, the guy who literally wrote the book on it, can be summed up by the phrase, "The history of any one part of the Earth, like the life of a soldier, consists of long periods of boredom and short periods of terror." So this is essentially the view that uniformitarianism is the norm, but there are some catastrophic events that have a significant impact on the geologic record in very short periods of time, like the Missoula floods that I talked about last week. But the best part about this is that the view of catastrophism that was accepted by geologists in the past was still incompatible with modern young Earth creationism. The view was that the Earth went through cycles where there would be ongoing and cumulative processes that happen slowly, much like uniformitarianism, but then those processes would be periodically interrupted by large-scale, worldwide, violent changes that served as a sort of reset before the slow cumulative processes would begin again. So, yeah, all this to say that uniformitarianism is true is not a statement that would be agreed to by modern geologists without first adding some caveats about large-scale catastrophes.
And they would have us believe that all humans descended from primates.
Since humans are definitionally primates, then if you descended from other humans, you are in fact descended from primates.
And that the world is 13.7 billion years old.
Okay, so by world, I guess you did mean universe. So sure, 13.7 billion years is the current estimate.
And that Darwinism is the truth.
Darwinism is not the truth. That evolution happens is a true statement, but in the same sense that Jesus said he is the truth, no, Darwinism is not the truth. Also, Darwinism is not just a catch-all for all aspects of evolution. Darwin didn't even know what DNA was, so the fact that molecular biology plays a huge role in our modern understanding of evolution takes it well outside the purview of what could be called Darwinism. I know creationists love the idea that the truth or falsity of a claim is tied directly to one specific person who is famous for having made that claim, but it's just not.
And I'd like to start on the first point. Either God created the world or the world created itself. Think about it. If everything was not created by an intelligent designer, that means that everything poofed into existence literally from nothing.
No, that's a false dichotomy. Poofing into existence from literally nothing, to borrow your loaded language, is one potential option, but there are many cosmological models, of which the universe from nothing is but one. But also, a cosmologist does not mean the same thing when they say nothing as an apologist does. The apologist would typically be referring to the philosophical nothing. The cosmologist would typically be referring to empty spacetime in the lowest energy state possible. It is not clear that a philosophical nothing would ever have existed, nor what the implications of its existence would even be.
That is a belief in magic and mysticism. That is sorcery. That's not science.
I forgot how much he likes to try and flip the accusation that creationism is magic on its head. Like, the dude literally believes that the universe began with a magical incantation, when God spoke things into existence. But yeah, sure, the models that explain how shit happens within the laws of physics are sorcery, apparently.
A lot of people think that it's scientific to make the claim that the world could create itself. Check out this quote from Stephen Hawking. He said that because there are laws such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Yes, he did say that, explicitly with reference to the argument about whether or not God was needed to create the universe. The next sentence is, "It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going." So what, you just want to claim victory because he said something in a slightly less precise way than I might prefer while giving an interview regarding one of his books aimed at a general audience? Okay, Matt, I suppose you win. Stephen Hawking did once phrase a thing in a way that lent itself to creationist quote mining. It's not really a point in your favor, though.
So, atheists really do believe that the world created itself. As wild as that may sound, as loony as it may be, that is what they believe. They think that that is actually based in science.
Fun fact, even if that is exactly what Hawking believed, and he meant exactly what Matt thinks he meant, that does not automatically mean that all atheists also believe it. I know Matt has a hard time with this, but atheism is not a religion. As such, we don't have religious figures that are revered in the same sense that Christianity does. Sure, Hawking was a brilliant theoretical physicist. I don't even come close to understanding even a small fraction of his life's work, and I never will. Does that mean I have to agree that the universe created itself from nothing because he phrased it that way once? No. Clearly what he meant there was more along the lines of the universe would spontaneously begin because of how the laws of physics operate. I mean, hell, the answer is right there in the quote. He says because there are laws such as gravity. Creationists usually don't grant the existence of the laws of physics as part of their definition of nothing, so unless Matt is planning to agree to a non-creationist definition of nothing, then Hawking clearly did not mean the same thing that creationists do when they say nothing.
But any of us who have studied the laws of thermodynamics know that matter cannot be created or destroyed.
Now, that statement actually puts on full display how we know that Matt has not, in fact, studied the laws of thermodynamics. Because energy is the thing that cannot be created or destroyed. Matter can, and it happens all the time. That's the whole E equals mc squared thing. I mean, I guess it's not technically destroyed, it's just converted into energy, and you can think of matter as essentially energy that's been locked up, but in every case, it will be more accurate to say that energy is the thing that cannot be created or destroyed.
And so they claim that before the Big Bang, everything was compacted down into an infinitely dense hot point.
Well, different models deal with it slightly differently, but that is the general understanding that you'd get from, watching the Big Bang Theory on TV.
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state.
And then that hot point somehow exploded and created time, space, and matter.
Just keep in mind here that Matt is yada-yadaing his way past literally dozens of cosmological models that all attempt to explain exactly how that happened. And Matt doesn't understand the first thing about any of them. Don't get me wrong, neither do I, but I also recognize that my lack of understanding does not translate into an ability to prove them wrong by reducing them down to ridiculous-sounding oversimplifications.
And like I said, that's a violation of the first law of thermodynamics.
Okay, Matt, so in your thermodynamic calculations that you obviously did in order to be able to say something like that, did you treat the universe as an isolated system? If so, why? If not, did you remember to account for the amount of energy contributed to the system from its surroundings? Did you take into consideration the fact that energy can both be negative and positive, with gravity generally being negative energy, with everything else being positive? Because as it turns out, when you do that, it looks very much like the total energy of the universe is actually zero, which means that you could potentially get an entire universe spontaneously forming from nothing without there being a creation or destruction of energy in the process. That's actually exactly what Hawking was referring to with the quote that you pulled up earlier. Essentially, while the universe expanded, it borrowed energy from the gravitational field in order to create matter, thus resulting in a universe with gravity, matter, and zero total energy.
And even if the universe just poofed into existence via a magic act, that also violates the second law of thermodynamics, because that states that everything in order tends towards disorder.
No, that is not what the second law of thermodynamics states. The second law is that the total entropy of an isolated system will increase over time, with entropy being a measurement of the amount of energy available to do work.
Nothing in nature really tends towards organization. It always tends towards disorganization.
Incorrect. Viral proteins spontaneously self-assemble into isocahedral capsids. Thread-like micelles spontaneously self-assemble from a random configuration of surfactant molecules. Peptides spontaneously self-assemble into beta sheet tapes. Do I know what any of this means? No, I don't, because I'm an idiot. But what I do know is that spontaneous self-assembly is a process that is utilized by scientists working in material sciences. That is, they use the natural tendency of certain molecules to form themselves into certain structures in order to make the structures that they want. So to claim that nature always moves from order to disorder is to ignore a shit ton of science that suggests otherwise.
Everything is winding down in the universe, but evolutionists would have us think that everything is winding up, that everything's getting better, that rocks evolved.
Getting better is a value judgment that doesn't really have a place in evolution. Sure, an organism that got better at surviving in its environment will be selected for over one that did not, but better in this sense is completely relative and arbitrary. There is no absolute standard of best possible organism that evolution is driving toward, it just works with whatever is good enough to get by from moment to moment. As to evolving from rocks, that is a misunderstanding that is at such a basic level that it wouldn't even be worth addressing if it weren't so common among creationists. They say it as though we believe that rocks were out there breeding like life does, and then one day some rock had a baby rock that was actually alive, and that is abiogenesis. But that's not even close to the truth. Basically, there are some components that are essential for life that are contained within rocks. Things like phosphorus, for instance. Some of these would still have been necessary for even the most basic life that would have been the first to develop on the Earth. So naturally, since some of the requirements for life can be found in rocks, the erosion of those rocks into an aqueous solution where their minerals are now free to react with other chemical compounds that are present is entirely plausible. So if that's what you mean when you say that evolutionists believe that we evolved from rocks, then by that logic, we are still made of rocks because these same minerals are still a necessary part of our biological functioning.
They don't just believe that life evolved, they believe that rocks evolved, that you had smaller rocks that somehow morphed into larger rocks.
And I'll bet you guys thought I was being hyperbolic when I was describing what creationists mean when they say we believe that we evolved from rocks. Well, I guess that's as good a clip as any to add to the Matt Powell being an idiot montage.
But in space, wouldn't it be a different scenario based on the fact that, the space and the air in the space is much different than the air we have here?
They believe that rocks evolved, that you had smaller rocks that somehow morphed into larger rocks.
That out of his mouth go burning lamps and sparks of fire leap out. The dinosaurs they discovered have, the dragons they've discovered have chambers in the back of their head so where they can breathe fire. But that's just a couple things. I mean,
if it's about survival of the fittest and we evolved from African Americans into other Americans, what about the African Americans that are still alive today?
well, I don't see anything wrong with quote mining. I believe if we study history, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls.
T-Rex, they had short, stubby arms. And apparently now the chicken's able to do a handstand with those arms.
Think about this. We have more in common genetically in certain areas with a gorilla than with an ape. Yet they say genetically we evolved from apes. We can tell based on genetics.
Honestly, John, I don't know a ton of technical terms. I'm very simple when it comes to science. I just enjoy simple science.
No joke. You can look it up.
No, you won't. You'll find articles talking about how the minerals contained within rocks were a necessary part of the equation. Nothing about rocks evolving into bigger rocks that eventually came to life. Now, don't get me wrong, there are processes by which rocks can grow. I mean, haven't we all grown crystals in those little science kits at one point or another? And that is functionally how salts are deposited. Hell, I even found a huge list of articles provided by a creationist on Reddit that supposedly proves that evolutionists believe we came from rocks. And every single one of those articles describes basically what I've already said here. There are a few that don't even get into minerals or rocks at all, and seem to have been included as list padding. But the ones that actually do talk about it don't mention rocks evolving into bigger rocks being part of the equation. The best part of this post by far, though, is the last sentence. Read these sources and find out that every time you drive a car, or go to the beach, or live inside of a building, you are desecrating your ancestors. I'm so sorry. I'm so very, very sorry, ancestors. Alas, poor York. I knew him, Horatio.
They think that all of this energy was compacted down and exploded and created larger pieces of rocks from this little piece of dust.
Okay, Matt, I know you follow Daddy Kent's school of 6 kinds of evolution, but shit like what you just said is exactly why that sort of misrepresentation should be avoided. I think what he was trying to say there is that the singularity expanded at the Big Bang, which caused the creation of light elements through nucleosynthesis, which took a few 100 million years to coalesce into gas clouds that had enough gravity to collapse into stars, which formed some of the heavier elements through stellar fusion, with nucleosynthesis as a result of supernovae being responsible for the formation of the elements heavier than iron, with planets forming as a result of the gravitational interaction and collision of material in protoplanetary disks, and then finally with the aforementioned erosion of minerals that would have been used for abiogenesis and eventually the evolution of multicellular organisms. But he's mangled it so badly that I can't be sure that that's what he's actually going for. But yeah, that is a very basic oversimplification of the current scientific understanding of how the universe went from Big Bang to what we see today. Obviously, there is a lot that I left out, as you can't exactly give a comprehensive summary of 13 billion years of the history of the universe in just a few seconds, but I feel like I did at least a little better than Matt did.
It's much easier to just simply say that God created the world and that the world did not create itself.
This may come as a surprise to you, Matt, but being simpler to say does not make something correct. Like, it is way easier to say that the Tangle Fairy makes my charging cables tangle in the drawer than to point out that every time I open and close the drawer, the cables are slightly agitated and the probability of spontaneous knot formation increases with agitation and is governed by several properties of the cable from stiffness to length to confinement, etc., with several mathematical relationships between all these properties and the resultant knots having various Jones polynomials. So, since it's easier to simply say the Tangle Fairy tangled my cables, does that mean it's true? This is Matt not understanding how to apply Occam's razor. Occam's razor is often mistakenly said to be the simpler of two explanations is more likely to be the true explanation. This is not inaccurate per se, but it depends on what you mean by simpler. Matt is looking at a dumbed-down version of syntactic simplicity, which measures the number and conciseness of an idea's basic principles. But ontological simplicity looks at the number and kinds of entities postulated by an idea. So for my Tangle Fairy example, it wins syntactic simplicity because it is quite concise and there is only one basic principle: a fairy tangles your cords. But ontologically, it has a greater number of kinds of entities. The more complex mathematical modeling includes the existence of the laws of physics and a force that does the agitating of the cords. The fairy model also includes the existence of the laws of physics because they govern how the cords behave in your drawer regardless of how they got tangled, but it also proposes the existence of the fairy, an additional entity that is not required by the mathematical model. So ontologically, the more syntactically complex model is actually the simpler one. The same thing goes for saying God did it as an explanation. All the scientific observations still apply, but now you're adding the universe-starting fairy into the mix without apparent justification other than to improve syntactic simplicity. And what's worse, when you actually dig into what God did it even means, in Matt's case as a young Earth creationist, he is now stuck with having to explain how God did it in a way that provides us with observations that lead to conclusions that are incompatible with his beliefs about how God did it.
And if I was to say that nothing caused an explosion to happen in this room that I'm filming in, nobody would believe that.
Right, but first and foremost, the kind of nothing that you're describing cannot be present in the room that you're filming in, by definition. So if you define it in a way that makes it impossible, yes, it's impossible. But also, we're talking about a situation where the laws of physics, as we intuitively understand them, would not work the same. Quantum forces would have been dominant at the beginning of the universe, and quantum shit is weird and unintuitive as fuck. So, is there a segment of your room where there is enough of an absence of matter and enough of a concentration of energy that it would actually be analogous to the situation that led to the Big Bang? I'm guessing no, making your analogy completely meaningless.
But yet we're supposed to believe that nothing caused the explosion at the beginning of time, space, and nature's origins?
No, the laws of physics did that.
If I said that a smaller rock could over time morph into a larger rock, nobody would believe that.
I mean, that's literally what sedimentary rock is. Little grains that were eroded away from other rocks, and sometimes whole rocks themselves, get cemented together to form bigger rocks. That's rather irrelevant to the theory of evolution, unless you want to get into the nitty-gritty, pun intended, of how the geological processes that led to the existence of sedimentary rock are what made the existence of clays and muds that may have harbored the first life possible, but now we're 2 levels of indirect away from actual biological evolution.
But I'm supposed to think that dust somehow morphed into rocks as large as planet Earth? That is not scientifically sound information at all.
Man, he is all over the map. Well, Matt, I'm not sure if you noticed this, but the Earth is not one single rock. It's a bunch of them, smushed together. Yeah, when you get deep enough into the core, it's molten, and so all the stuff that could become rocks gets mixed together and might be said to be a singular object. But you yourself have pointed out in the past that there are distinct slabs in the upper mantle which are not the same as their surrounding material. You were wrong and thought that those slabs were submerged in molten rock rather than really, really hot and somewhat ductile and viscous solid rock, but that still shows an awareness of multiple constituent parts of the Earth. So, do you deny the idea that when you put many small things together, it makes a big pile of those small things? Do you deny that the heating of things can cause them to fuse together into one object? Do you deny that being under high pressure increases heat? These are all incredibly basic things that you should have learned before high school. Help, I have a kindergartner in my house who can tell you that when you put a lot of little things in one place, it makes a pile that is bigger than any one of the little things. This is the level of denial that Matt is at here. He doesn't believe in accumulation. How the fuck can there be 30 centimeters of snow when each snowflake is so damn tiny? That's impossible! I guess Canada doesn't exist? And what about snowballs? God, don't even get me started on those. Imagine pressing many little things together to make one single bigger thing. Snowmen are impossible, I guess, too. Frosty the Snowman is satanic propaganda to indoctrinate kids away from Christianity. You gotta avoid that shit like the plague.
There's no question that God created the world. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Doesn't the Bible say?
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
The Bible says a lot of things. Shove her!
Even NASA said this: although the Big Bang Theory is widely accepted, it will probably never be proved, consequentially leaving a number of tough and unanswered questions.
The reason he's quoting NASA as having said that, as though an administrative organization made up of thousands of employees at any given time could be quoted the same way as a specific person could, is because that quote can only be found on an anonymously authored Q&A post from 1997 that is only available through the Wayback Machine today. This is likely written by a PR agent rather than a scientist, and as such should not be considered to be NASA's official stance. But also, the concept of proof is different in science than it is in colloquial speech. To quote theoretical astrophysicist Ethan Siegel, science, remember, is not mathematics. You cannot formally prove that something is a certain way. What you can do is establish that one particular set of ideas is valid, consistent with everything observed and measured within the universe, and show how that stands in contrast to other competing ideas that fail to agree with the observations and measurements that have been taken. The Big Bang is consistent with everything observed and measured within the universe, and is by far the best explanation put forward thus far. And it's not like it was proposed in 1927 and then just universally accepted by scientists. Einstein himself initially hated the proposition. But as time went on, more and more actual observations lined up with the predictions made by the Big Bang model, causing the consensus to grow and Einstein to come around to accepting it. So yeah, if you want to be pedantic, we have not proven the Big Bang. We have just confirmed that the model accurately predicted many aspects of how the universe operates that we have since observed, the most recent of which being the direct observation of gravitational waves in 2015.
Granite rock is incredible. We cannot create it. With all of our highest tech instruments, we can create diamonds, but we can't create granite.
Whether or not that is true, it is completely irrelevant. Our current level of technological achievement has nothing to do with whether or not evolution is true, which, I'll remind you, is supposed to be the topic of this video. It's called A Christian Response to Evolution, but so far he's only barely hinted at abiogenesis and spent the rest of his time complaining about astrophysics. Neither of those two things are evolution, except in the most vague, they are things that changed over time sense, and creationists would do well to stop equating those things with evolution to avoid the confusion that Matt has been putting on full display for this whole video.
So I'm supposed to believe that a rock that cannot be created by man on purpose somehow created itself by accident.
Loaded language aside, yes. Just because we can't do something that nature can, does not mean that it can't happen without a god. There are many things that nature can do that we can't, like the sustained fusion reaction that's happening within the sun. Even if we did figure out sustained fusion here on Earth, we don't have equipment on a scale that would be capable of replicating the process in the sun, yet it still happens regardless. Also, if this were a reliable metric, then the things that nature is capable of without God's intervention was once a much larger category than it is today, as much of our scientific understanding has happened in the last couple centuries.
It's ridiculous. We believe in the creation model that life started on the land. but they will say that life began in the water or in the oceans.
Water, yes. Oceans, not necessarily. Could have been pools or ponds that were subject to periodic drying out, with wet-dry cycling leading to a concentration of molecules that were necessary for life.
And in this Inside Science article, they say the first hefty organic molecules may have formed within tiny droplets. So what they're trying to say is that the first molecules that eventually formed into life were coming together inside of water. So follow this with me. They say that pretty much all of these guys agree that in some way, the creation of life involved water.
And there is Matt being dishonest. Though, in this case, I don't know why he would use dishonesty, so this might just be his incompetence on full display. But you'd think from the way that he said that this is the body of the Inside Science article that he was showing, but he has, without indicating that he has done this, pivoted to a different article from Illinois Science called Did Life Begin in the Oceans? Like I said, I'm not sure why he would make this pivot. Water was almost certainly a part of the process of abiogenesis in one way or another, but he should at least indicate when he's switching between articles.
But if you were to type in on the internet, how does DNA get destroyed? The very first thing that pops up is this. It says DNA is vulnerable. It breaks down in sunlight and in water.
Yeah, and of course we all know that the very first thing that pops up on Google is always the most accurate answer. Come on, man, it is notorious for taking things out of context. In this case, that's from an article in The Guardian that's explaining how it is that we found DNA that survived in fossils for 70,000 years. Also, nobody thinks that DNA was the first molecule to form in the origin of life. The first genetic molecule is generally thought to have been either RNA-like polymers or protein, but depending on what we mean when we say first, the first molecule related to life could have been a number of things. A phospholipid bilayer, simple organic molecules like methane, a more complex organic molecule like an amino acid, or something else. It's hard to draw the line, because the line where prebiotic chemistry ends and biology begins is a fuzzy one, and also we don't know exactly what order these molecules were incorporated into what would ultimately become the first life, so saying which one was first is more than a little bit tricky. My point is that nobody thinks DNA formed as the first molecule involved with abiogenesis, so by the time DNA came around, the mechanisms that prevent it from breaking down would have already been in place. I mean, Matt, you are made up of about 70% water. Does that mean that your DNA is constantly being destroyed? Or is water just a part of the chemical processes that your body relies on, mostly acting as a solvent for transporting molecules?
They would have us believe that the RNA world where life came from non-life was in a soup, in water. Well, water destroys biology.
You cursed rat! Look what you've done! I'm melting! Oh, what a world! What a world!
Water destroys biology, he says, while being a pile of biology that is mostly made of water. Wait, should I avoid pointing out that a bunch of little cells make up his body, given his incredulity at the idea of a bunch of small things making up a bigger thing? No, I shouldn't. If I avoided talking about every topic that confused the fuck out of Matt, I'd never be able to talk about anything ever again. My family might like that.
It destroys organic molecules.
Okay. First off, did you really need a cut between it destroys and organic molecules? Like, I fuck up my script enough that I'm not going to go hard on people who use jump cuts. I try to hide mine with a slight zoom, but if you're paying attention, you'll usually be able to find them. Though not every zoom is a screw up. Sometimes I do that for emphasis, so you can't just count the zooms. Okay, too close. Back it up, editing Rhino. Okay, that's better. Jeez, that guy's touchy. Well, maybe I'd be more chill if you got your act together and stopped fucking up every other line. Yeah, okay, that's fair. I do screw up a lot. Anyway, he's now moved on from it destroys DNA to saying it destroys organic molecules. And that's just not true. It actually facilitates the formation of organic molecules. In one experiment, researchers found that dissolved air in ultra-purified water would form an organic membrane as the water flowed through micro-orifices. And this wasn't even research related to the origin of life. They were studying microfluid mechanics to find potential industrial applications. Water literally facilitates the formation of organic molecules, so to say that it destroys them as though that were a true statement in every context is just laughable. And also, once again, he's sitting there, relying on the action of organic molecules in his body, while also being made up mostly of water. So the fact that he exists is itself proof that he is wrong. It's not often that a creationist will say something so idiotic that their own existence directly proves them wrong, but hey, it's Matt Powell.
So to assert that life began in the water or in the oceans when it was raining for 2 million years is ludicrous. That's false.
And just to address the raining for 2 million years thing, that was a period of time in the Triassic when global warming caused by about 5 million years of unusually high volcanic activity led to an increased rainfall over the interior of the supercontinent Pangaea. It was not constant rain for 2 million years straight, just more rain than was normal. The interior of Pangaea throughout the Triassic was almost entirely an arid and dry environment, so when geologists started finding things like flood and coal deposits, it stood out as an outlier. After the volcanoes calmed down, the carbon cycle stabilized and Pangaea went back to being mostly arid until it began breaking up at the end of the Triassic. Matt will always present it as though it was 2 million years of constant rainfall, usually with a comparison to the 40 days and 40 nights of rain in the biblical story. But as with everything Matt says, that is based on a gross misunderstanding of what it even is.
Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools.
And that is Matt taking the Bible out of context. I'll read it in the King James because Matt, for some reason, favors that outdated and archaic translation that was based on a Greek translation known to have many issues, but no matter. That is Romans 1:22. The next sentence, verse 23, is, "And changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things." So the professing themselves to be wise they became fools is not referring to the study of biology, but to the worshipping of idols. Now, I know Matt would claim that modern biology is an idol for atheists, but that ignores the biblical definition of what an idol is. In this case, an actual physical thing that is made in the image of either humans, birds, beasts, or creeping things, not a field of scientific research.
When detectives do forensic work, they can actually look at somebody that died in fire versus water, and they can trace the DNA molecules of somebody that died in fire easier than it is for tracing them in a situation where somebody died in water. And so what that means is water scatters DNA faster than fire does.
That's actually a harder comparison to make than you might think. DNA can still be found in about 60% of tested scenarios where temperatures of the fire got to 1,000 degrees Celsius, so yes, DNA can still be found after exposure to fire, but the experiment only had them exposed to that level of heat for about 10 minutes. Editing Rhino here. Scripting Rhino misread the study. They did not expose the samples to that level of heat for 10 minutes. They removed the samples as soon as the temperatures reached their target, and for the hottest test, the one where the temperatures reached 1,000 degrees Celsius, it took about 10 minutes to get there. So it is likely that prolonged exposure at that temperature would have yielded significantly worse results, though the paper does not address that. The main purpose of the paper was not to assess how long DNA samples could withstand various temperatures, but rather to demonstrate that usable samples could potentially be recovered from fires that surpassed 800 degrees Celsius, as that was the previous cutoff point at which it was assumed that there would be no more usable DNA. And they did accomplish that. Back to you, Recording Rhino. It would be reasonable to infer that the longer the exposure, the less DNA will be found. On the flip side, however, with water, it very much depends on the environmental conditions of the water. In an outdoor pond in the winter, for instance, complete DNA samples could still be recovered after 2 weeks of exposure, but it only lasted between 4 hours and 1 day in a pond and river environment in the summer. This general mix has led to a rule of thumb that you can expect to find usable DNA samples on a body that has been in the water for about a week, but you should still try even if it's been longer. But also, both of these studies were looking at samples on surfaces. The fire was looking at blood on various implements that could have been involved in a homicide, and the water was looking at DNA not belonging to the victim that might be found on their clothing. When it comes to the DNA of an actual body, fire destroys it much more thoroughly than water, leaving us looking in places like the interior of bones and teeth, where it would have been mostly well protected, whereas DNA in waterlogged bodies can be readily collectible from under the fingernails for at least a month. At any rate, this is a claim that could go either way depending on how you frame it, but it's also irrelevant, as it's referring to bodies after the biological functions that keep everything in homeostasis cease. When talking about abiogenesis, we're talking about the very development of those functions, so it ceases to be a meaningful comparison. The ones that didn't work didn't become a part of life. The ones that did. Not a problem.
And so what that tells us is that this abiogenesis process of life coming from non-life in soup is more likely to happen in a grill at 1,000 degrees Celsius than in water.
Nope, that is not what it tells us, not even a little bit. I mean, hey, if we pretend that Matt's right, then that means we should start looking for life on Mercury.
The Bible tells us that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul.
Earlier, Matt was aghast at the idea that little rocks could be piled up into a big pile of rocks. Now he's saying that God made man by piling up some dirt and giving it mouth-to-nose resuscitation? But yeah, small things adding up to become a big thing is the ridiculous thing to believe here.
So life obviously began on the land. It didn't begin in the water.
Oh, come on, Matt. Could you please at least get your own damn side right? You're ignoring the order of creation. In Genesis 1, the plants came first, then the sea creatures and birds, then the land animals, and last of all, man. Now, if you treat Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as the separate creation myths that they are, Genesis 2 does indeed have God creating man first, but most creationists like to pretend that chapter 2 is expanding on the details of day 6 of chapter 1. So either Matt is disagreeing with most creationists and actually accepting the scholarly consensus on something, that would be unheard of for him, or he's got the order of creation wrong. Or what is actually more likely in my opinion, he is so incapable of seeing things from any perspective but his own that the creation of all the life before God created humans isn't actually seen as God creating life, he's merely setting the stage for the actual life that he will create in human beings. I mean, if we go with the order of creation in Genesis 1, the Bible still gets it wrong and has terrestrial plants created first, but my point is that if Matt wants to use the Bible to support life being on land before the sea, then he should use the verse where God created life on land before he does so in the sea, not the one that creationists explicitly claim comes after God created life in the sea.
But if you were to type in, where did life come from? This is the origin story that they're given. It says that experiments suggest that organic molecules could have been synthesized in the atmosphere of early Earth and rained down into the oceans.
And we've all seen at this point that Matt is incapable of moving past the first thing he sees when he Googles something, so we know he's not going to put any effort into actually understanding any of that. He's just going to see that it happened in water and go, ha! The first result of a different Google search told me that water destroys DNA, so it can't be water!
That is ludicrous. That is false. That is not true.
Well, that specific model might not be true, but the general idea almost certainly is, your personal incredulity notwithstanding.
God created life. And even if you had all of the elements for life together in some sort of soup, the soup is just going to scatter the elements. It's not going to assemble them.
Can you point to any research that actually says that? Do you even have a screenshot of the first result of a Google search to support that? Or are you just having to assume that based on your other lazy Google searches?
And even if you had a single-celled organism that somehow magically was created out of this soupy mess, what's it going to eat?
Soup, obviously. That's why universally all organisms on the planet just love soup. It's built into our biology because the first meal of the first organism ever was a bowl of soup. Okay, Matt's dumb enough that he might think I'm being serious here, so let me explicitly state that that was a statement meant to be so ridiculous that it was obviously a joke, but with a kernel of truth. The stuff in what you're calling soup is, as you said, the elements necessary for the formation of this cell. So it absorbs those elements from its environment in order to continue existing, just like single-celled organisms do today.
There's no other biology around.
Well, I mean, first off, it probably wasn't formed as one singular single-celled organism. It was probably a bunch of them formed at the same time, but let's just assume that there was only one of them. Sure, there's not other organisms around for it to eat, but single-celled organisms do not necessarily prey on other single-celled organisms in order to survive. They utilize raw materials that can be found in their environment. True, there are some that prey on other microorganisms. In fact, most of them probably do. But that is a development that didn't have to come until later. Hell, the cells in your body don't eat other cells. They eat energy-rich molecules like sugars. Did you think that your body's cells had to cannibalize each other to stay alive? Hell, who are we kidding? You probably didn't even know that your body was made out of cells based on the fact that you don't think that things can be made of smaller things.
There's no other organic material. What's it going to eat? Hard rock?
Why in the world would there not be any other organic material in the soup that was rich enough in organic material to form life?
Think about this.
You should try that sometime. It might do you some good.
There is nothing for it. It just is going to come alive, and then it's got to find another organism to reproduce with.
Matt? Do you think that all organisms reproduce sexually? You know that cell division is a thing, right? Why would sexual reproduction be the first type of reproduction to evolve? Especially since it's a bunch of autocatalytic reactions that would have led to the first life in the first place, and not sex.
The unanswered questions will remain unanswered by the evolutionist and atheist community on this matter because they're not actually looking at things with a scientific lens. They're looking at it with an emotional lens.
There are certainly unanswered questions in origin of life research, but Matt has failed to bring any of those up at this point because he doesn't understand it well enough to even find a relevant unanswered question. And the dude literally said that life came from God making a dirt model and then blowing on it. Where's the science in that? What process transformed the dirt into flesh and blood? What role did blowing in the nose serve? What chemistry was involved there? Matt doesn't have the slightest idea, because it's a story written by a culture that also didn't have the slightest idea that any of those were even questions that would need answering, in an attempt to explain a phenomenon that they didn't understand.
Questions. Questions that need answering.
The Bible is a fascinating look into the history and culture of an ancient civilization, but a science textbook it is not. Treating it as a science textbook is, frankly, insulting to the culture that produced it.
Because they don't want to answer to God, and they don't want to admit that creationism is so strong.
How is it strong? I'm begging you to tell me. You've provided nothing here to support creationism other than Bible verses, and you've provided nothing that refutes evolution, abiogenesis, the Big Bang, or whatever other field of science you think you understand, because you stopped at the first result of all your Google searches and refused to read more than a paragraph past the headline when you even bother to read that far.
And it has a very powerful model that supports it in the scientific community, and they don't want to give it any credence at all.
What model, Matt? Show me the model.
Show me the
Model. Show me a paper outlining the model that doesn't have to appeal to magic at some point and actually explains everything scientifically. You can't because it doesn't exist.
They're afraid of creationism. They can laugh at it, they can mock it, they can fulfill what the Bible says that they would do, which is be scoffers of the last days that scoff and mock the Bible.
The vast, vast majority of the research papers that I've presented here do nothing of the sort. And the one that might be considered to be mocking creationists was the one that I didn't even need to include. I just thought it was hilarious. The scientific fields that you call wild, loony, ridiculous, ludicrous, foolish, and more mostly just ignore creationists and continue on their merry way. To complain about being mocked in a video where you yourself repeatedly throw mocking insults at the people that you complain are mocking you is kind of pathetic, to be honest.
That is a belief in magic and mysticism. That is sorcery. As wild as that may sound, as loony as it may be, it's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. That's false. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. That is ludicrous. That is false. You had a single-celled organism that somehow magically was created out of this soupy mess. And the way that this paper starts out is hilarious. It's pretty hilarious. I mean, they think that non-life brought life into existence. It gets more and more and more insane. It really is unbelievable. We're entering into the twilight zone. Stay tuned. I can't imagine having to be an atheist and defend this stuff. The scientifically illiterate atheist.
I'm not going to pretend that I'm not mocking Matt in this video, but I'm also not pretending to take the high ground and using Matt's mockery as a point in my favor, like Matt is trying to do here. But also, I'm not really mocking the Bible, I'm mocking Matt's interpretation of the Bible. Like I said, as an anthropological artifact, the Bible is incredibly valuable and insightful, but Matt is treating it as though it's a science book, which is just patently absurd. And so I mock the view that a book that presents the world as being a flat snow globe type thing propped up by pillars could provide us any sort of insight into our modern understanding of things like cosmology, things that the authors of the Bible couldn't possibly have known about. But also, that's easily the most obvious prophecy that any founder of a new religion could write about their religion. People will mock us. Yeah, of course they will. That's what happens to new religions. But honestly, my favorite iteration of the "this is what people will act like in the end times" prophecies is the one in Matthew 24, 37 through 39. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So, a sign of the end times is that people will eat, drink, and get married. Yeah, that's super duper specific. There's never been a time on the planet other than the time of Noah and the end times where people ate, drank, and got married. That's almost as bad as the "there will be wars and rumors of wars" one.
And as Christians and creationists, we would claim that life was designed by God. And according to evolution, life was eroded from rocks. So not only did life come alive in soup, supposedly that soup originated from rocks getting rained on, and then those minerals were eroded from the rocks, which caused life to somehow spark into existence.
Oh, holy shit, he actually kind of understands that one. So, was he just lying when talking about it earlier then? I mean, that fits his MO pretty well, but normally he wouldn't turn around and then be honest about the thing he was lying about.
And if you were to type in, "you owe your life to a rock," it brings up a paper called "You Owe Your Life to Rock."
That's not a paper, Matt. That is an article. You really should learn the difference, especially if you're going to try and speak with any amount of authority on anything scientific.
And the way that this paper starts out is hilarious. It says, "Thank goodness for granite."
I mean, it's slightly amusing if you like alliteration, which I do, but hilarious is a bit of a stretch.
Those are the first words of the paper. It talks about how granite rock is our ancestor.
Oh, for fuck's sake, Matt, you literally just explained that we're not descended from rocks, but that minerals that eroded from rocks were a part of the abiogenesis process. And now you're going back to rocks being our ancestors? Come on, man, I don't have very high expectations for you, but is it really too much to ask that you at least stumble your way over the bar every once in a while?
Remember the rock that we covered earlier that can't be created on purpose, somehow created itself by accident, and then somehow conceived life.
No, the rock did not conceive life. We don't believe in pregnant rocks. Where the fuck are you even getting that from? That is not what it says in that article. Hell, that article isn't even about abiogenesis. It's about how the erosion of metal-rich granites provided new nutrients to single-celled organisms that they needed in order to make the jump to multicellular organisms. So this isn't even life coming from a rock, it's just life using new resources to evolve.
Now, of course, they want to mock the virgin birth, but to say that granite rock conceived life? Granite rock isn't even living to begin with. At least Mary was alive when she conceived of the Holy Spirit.
At least the teenager was alive when God raped her. Isn't the win you seem to think it is, Matt?
That's pretty hilarious. I mean, they think that non-life brought life into existence, that unconsciousness brought conscious, sentient material into existence.
And you think that a magical man made a dirt sculpture and blew life up its nose. And what's more, my description is way closer to being accurate to what you actually believe than yours is of what I believe. You might want to quibble over my use of the word magic, but aside from that, that is literally what you described when you gave the biblical account. And you can't tell me what mechanism would have transformed the dirt into flesh and blood, so magic is just as valid a term to use there as any.
That nothing somehow created something. It gets more and more and more insane the more that you look into what atheists and evolutionists actually believe.
It only gets insane if you listen to Matt misrepresent it with his pregnant rocks and whatnot. If you actually take the time to understand it, even at a superficial level, it actually makes perfect sense.
I heard somebody say one time that it's unbelievable what unbelievers will believe to remain unbelievers, and I feel like that is actually kind of true.
I don't know, that sounds like projection to me. Because here's the thing, most unbelievers don't actually have even a superficial level of understanding of these things because they just don't matter to your day-to-day life. They just hear you talk about how God killed himself to save us from what he'd do to us if we don't worship him, and don't think that that makes any sense, so they move on with their lives without concerning themselves about cosmic origins or the fine details of biology. But believers, especially young Earth creationists, have to believe in literal magic, even if they don't like that word, it fits the definition, in order to believe that God made everything only 6,000 years ago, but did so in a way that made everything look billions of years old.
It really is unbelievable. We're entering into the twilight zone. Stay tuned. And this paper also says that rocks and minerals must have played key roles in virtually every phase of life's emergence.
Again, that is an article, not a paper. And at this point, I have a suspicion. You see, this is now the second article that Matt has used that is also in that Reddit post that I mentioned earlier that lists a bunch of sources that they claim prove that evolutionists believe we came from rocks. And do you guys know how I found that Reddit post? Earlier, when he said that evolutionists believe that rocks evolved, no joke, you can look it up, I did. I googled, do biologists believe that rocks evolved? And guess what the first result was? It was that Reddit post. So the suspicion I have here, given that Matt only seems capable of reading the first result of any given Google search, is that that's exactly how Matt found this Reddit post, and rather than look into anything for himself, he just copied their homework. Too bad none of their links actually said what they claim was being said.
Check this out. It says, rare meteorite that fell on a UK driveway may contain ingredients for life. And so in this paper, you can see what they're insinuating. They're insinuating that life ultimately came from a rock.
No, they're not insinuating anything. They're saying that the building blocks of life are capable of forming in outer space and can be delivered to Earth via meteor. This is important for two reasons. First, it's a potential delivery mechanism for some of the building blocks of life. And second, if the building blocks of life can form in the extremely hostile environment that is outer space, then it's conceivable, if not downright plausible, that they could also form on the more hospitable surface of the Earth. But sure, go ahead and say that we believe we evolved from meteors or some shit.
That is what they believe, and that's hard to defend that position. that you came from a rock. I can't imagine having to be an atheist and defend this stuff.
It is a hard position to defend. Good thing it's not what anyone actually believes. I can't imagine being a Christian and having to be this blatant of a liar in order to hold on to my beliefs. Like, seriously, Matt, you know you're lying. I know you know that. I've seen you dishonestly edit people. I've seen you call someone who explicitly said that she believes in God an atheist because she phrased things in a way that you thought would be useful in an attempt to mischaracterize what atheists believe. Even if everything you've said in this video is just because you're an idiot and not lying, you do lie a lot, and in ways where it is impossible for you to not know what you're doing. So if those are the kind of sleazy tactics you have to engage in to make your worldview even look remotely plausible, then what does that say about your worldview?
And if you look at this paper, it says that the ingredients for life in space rocks that fell to the Earth, and it talks about how these rocks contained liquid water. And so again, they're trying to insinuate that life was created from water that eroded minerals out of rocks.
And again, you flip-flop back to actually understanding that it's the eroded minerals interacting with the other compounds that is the key here. But I also noticed that for this article, again that's an article not a paper, you're ignoring the part where they found a mix of complex organic compounds such as hydrocarbons and amino acids. You said earlier that water destroys organic compounds.
Water destroys biology. It destroys organic molecules.
And yet you have an article on your screen right now that points out that these meteorites contained both liquid water and the organic compounds you said couldn't possibly form in the presence of water. This is why it's impossible for you to actually read your sources carefully. I'm not even asking you to go to the actual papers, just actually read the articles that you are using as sources, and read them slowly, looking up the big words as you go. You don't have to stay an idiot, Matt. You can get better. You just need to stop lying and actually put some effort into understanding these things.
And to the scientifically illiterate atheist, he or she will just eat this right up.
Oh my god, you're calling atheists scientifically illiterate when you literally had a source on your screen that blatantly contradicted your earlier scientific claim about organic compounds in water without even noticing? That's rich.
They'll think it's just, oh, this is incredible. This is great knowledge.
Again, yes. If you actually put the effort in to understand what the fuck you're reading, it is great knowledge.
As Christians, we're supposed to be free thinkers, and we're supposed to be skeptical of demonstrated lies like these ones that we're looking at.
Where in the Bible does it tell you to be a free-thinking skeptic? Atheists aren't the ones who say that you'll go to an eternal torture dungeon if you don't believe the same thing as me. That is not free thought, that is coerced compliance.
And in creationism, we believe that dinosaurs lived recently.
Indeed, creationists do believe a bunch of things that are demonstrably false.
But according to evolution, dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago.
Incorrect. Dinosaurs did not live 65 million years ago, they went extinct about 66 million years ago. They lived during the Mesozoic, which was a span of time that ranged from 245 million years ago to 66 million years ago. I know that's what Matt was probably going for, and in the last video I did give him a gold star for getting this one right when he remembered to say the plus that came after the 65 in that statement, but honestly, I'm not sure he deserves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to misspeaking anymore. It wasn't that long ago that I would have just granted the idea that Matt knows what piles are, but we learned last time that this is a concept that is a bit too much for him to grasp. So yeah, maybe I'm nitpicking, but in this case, it might actually be necessary.
Let's go ahead and do some scientific analysis of this as well. Let's see who's correct. We find dinosaur blood cells in dinosaur bones that are supposedly 65 million years old.
We do not. We find structures that are morphologically similar to red blood cells, and which may indeed be made out of material that was original to the organism, but which are molecularly different, having gone through processes such as cross-linking, which render the materials less susceptible to degradation over time. To quote the paper that you are actually citing here, some regions of the demineralized bone matrix are highly fibrous, and the matrix possesses elasticity and resilience. 3 populations of microstructures have cell-like morphology. Thus, some dinosaurian soft tissues may retain some of their original flexibility, elasticity, and resilience.
These bioorganic materials that we're finding, like blood cells, blood vessels, hemoglobin in the blood, check this out. There's over 16 types of bioorganic materials that are found in dinosaur bones. They're all biodegradable. Remember, that's what bioorganic even means. It means that it's material that will biodegrade.
I mean, when I looked it up, it said that it was pertaining to the composition and biological activity of carbon-based compounds, especially those of laboratory rather than biogenic origin, so honestly, this sounds like you just trying to use a big word to sound smart, but failing because you're not. But yeah, the structures that they found are normally biodegradable, which is why some sort of preservation mechanism has to be at work in order to, preserve them. And while we do not have a perfect understanding of those mechanisms yet, we're getting there. We know that iron-mediated radical cross-linking, where iron reacts with oxygen to form iron oxides that form a protective coating around organic molecules and acts as a stabilizer, has the effect of protecting these structures from decay through the activity of things like bacteria and fungi, as well as the actions of the body's own enzymes. There's also the fact that these soft tissues are most likely found in bones that have been encased in mineral concretions, which are exactly what it sounds like they are. They're basically naturally occurring concrete that forms around the bones. The concretion protects the bones from groundwater, which would very rapidly destroy the soft tissue structures within them. So we find biomolecules that are morphologically similar to certain soft tissue structures, which are only ever found in the most protected areas of a fossil in conditions favorable to chemical processes that are known to preserve biomolecules for long periods of time. Color me unimpressed.
You have to ask this question. Could dinosaur blood last for 65 million years?
Pedantry about whether it's blood or biomolecules that are morphologically similar to blood cells aside, yes, it could. Honestly though, if such soft tissues were an indication that the Earth is young, then why don't the majority of bones yield such tissues? If them being only thousands of years old instead of millions is why they're not fully permineralized, then why is it that so many of them are? Soft tissue would be the norm, not the exception, would it not? And yet, even for the soft tissue we do find, it's not actually soft and pliable until they put it in a solution that dissolves all the minerals that have been protecting the soft tissues this whole time.
The answer is no.
Only if you don't know what you're talking about, so yeah, I can't say I'm surprised here.
Some people will say that iron cross-linking somehow preserved the dinosaur blood.
Some people, being literally every paleontologist who has anything to do with it, yes.
Well, here's the thing. Even if you submerged that blood in iron and then sealed that for millions of years.
If you submerged blood in iron, does Matt think that the way it works is blood cells are plunked down into molten iron? Does Matt not know that hemoglobin, one of the defining proteins of red blood cells, contains iron? Like, that's how your blood gets oxygen around the body. The oxygen binds to the iron in hemoglobin. Oh, and hey, there's oxygen, that second molecule that was important to the cross-linking process. Can't form iron oxides without the oxide part of oxide, after all. So, no, blood cells were not submerged in iron. They contain iron. That's kind of their whole shtick.
The blood is still going to deteriorate. Yes, iron can cause blood cells to be preserved for a short time, but for millions of years?
Why not? Do you have anything to back up the idea that it can't? Something more solid than just your personal incredulity would be preferred here.
Have you ever been to a relative's house and you see them can foods? That food that they have tried to seal up and preserve still will go bad over time, over just a few years in some cases.
I feel like there's a lot to unpack just in the question, have you ever been to a relative's house and seen them can food? Like, maybe Matt has never personally played around with canning on his own. I get it, you'd need to involve a stove in that, and not trusting Matt around a stove is a smart choice. But like, does Matt go to relatives' houses for like food canning parties or something? Is that a normal thing? Am I the weird one here? Are canning parties one of those American traditions that I'm just not aware of? Or is Matt the weird one here? I don't actually know. Whatever. That aside, canning food doesn't preserve the food by cross-linking. It preserves the food by removing things from the environment that cause the food to spoil. Oxygen, bacteria, fungi, etc. Assuming you follow the canning procedures perfectly, some foods can last several years, but yes, they will all go bad eventually. But the canning process did not alter the molecular structure of the food to make it more stable, it minimized the presence of factors that cause it to spoil. Cross-linking would be more akin to preserving the hide of a cow by putting it through the tanning process, where various chemicals are applied to facilitate, says here, cross-linking. Huh. What do you know? And given that we've found well-preserved leather artifacts that are nearly 6,000 years old, I'd say it's fairly reasonable to suggest that microscopic amounts of tissue that went through a similar preservation process as leather could survive for millions of years in very well-protected interiors of bones that are covered in concretions. Now, does Matt share my feeling that this is reasonable? Obviously not. But given that we have found microscopic amounts of highly cross-linked tissue in fossils that are demonstrably millions of years old, we have two options here. Either it is possible for such tissue to be preserved, or essentially all of paleontology and geology has to be thrown out at a minimum. Which, yeah, that is exactly what Matt is advocating for here, but using "I have a hard time wrapping my tiny little brain around topics that I clearly don't understand" as an argument against at least two entire fields of science just doesn't cut it.
And in the dinosaur bones, we also find carbon-14.
And notice that to support the claim that we found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, he has a screenshot of an explanation of how carbon dating works, not an article or paper documenting the finding of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Probably because the only papers documenting such finds are ones that explain why carbon dates for such specimens are unreliable, and they aren't subtle about it. They point out that radiocarbon that is found in dinosaur fossils is pretty much exclusively the result of contamination processes. Bacterial activity, recrystallization, uranium decay, and even the application of glue that is often used during the excavation process. Bacterial activity, I would hope, is obvious. Microbes live everywhere, and being carbon-based life, contain, carbon. So as they go about their business, some of their carbon will contaminate whatever surface they are on. Recrystallization is the process by which fossils become permineralized. Over time, one mineral replaces another mineral. One common mineral that replaces the original material in fossils is calcite, the most stable form of calcium carbonate. You may notice from the name calcium carbonate that calcite contains carbon. Okay, I'll stop saying it like that. I'm sorry. So if the original bone material is replaced over time with a carbon-bearing mineral, then that means that this mineral will bring in radiocarbon that is not original to the organism and would throw off the dating process even if we could date such old specimens with carbon dating. You wouldn't be dating the animal whose bones made the fossil, you'd be dating the material that replaced those bones over a process that could have potentially taken thousands to millions of years. Uranium decay produces radiation that, if it interacts with nitrogen molecules, will produce carbon-14. This is actually basically the same process by which carbon-14 is produced in the atmosphere, except up there it's cosmic rays rather than exposure to uranium. And important to mention here, when carbon-14 decays, it becomes nitrogen-14. So any carbon-14 that has already decayed into nitrogen has the potential to be irradiated back into carbon-14. And then of course there's the use of glue during excavation. Plenty of glues contain carbon, so the use of one of those glues will, naturally, lead to contamination with carbon. Notably, even for samples that are young enough to be carbon dated, bones are not the preferred sample type, with bones only yielding accurate dates when the sample is younger than about 5,000 years.
Remember, carbon-14 only lasts 50,000 years. The half-life is 5,730 years, and so every 5,730 years, half of the C14 exits the bones.
No, absolutely not. That's not how any of this works. Carbon-14 doesn't just disappear, it decays into nitrogen. The nitrogen then stays put unless it's hit by radiation that can bump it back into being carbon-14. Given that this process is reversible, it stands to reason that there are situations where it can, in fact, be reversed. And as it turns out, there are.
Well, how is it that these bones are loaded with C14?
Loaded is being more than a touch hyperbolic. Best I can find is that some creationists got dates for Mesozoic fossils that were as young as 9,000 years old, which, yes, does seem significant, but becomes rather obvious once you learn that scientists who use radiocarbon dating are well aware of the contamination processes that I've already described, and specifically with regards to bone samples, the contamination becomes significant and must be accounted for once a sample reaches an age of about 8,000 years. Now, of course, this does not mean that a maximally contaminated sample will yield a result of 8,000 years old. This lining up of dates is probably coincidental more than anything. But my main point here is that the older the sample is, the more of an impact contamination will play on the sample. This can generally be accounted for, but the uncertainty goes up as the sample gets older. Did the creationists that sent the Mesozoic fossil in for carbon dating do anything to account for this? Or were they just looking for any carbon-14 that they could just jump on in order to push their narrative? I think we all know the answer to that question.
That's because they died recently, because these bones are not millions of years old. They weren't sitting in the ground for millions of years and got contaminated by C14 from the atmosphere. That's not what happened.
You're right. That's not what happened. Atmospheric C14 generally doesn't contaminate samples, and specific to carbon dating, samples that are exposed are actually easier to date, because the contaminants are mostly things that are found in the ground. Bury a sample and the bacteria that is already in the dirt will go to work contaminating it right away, but there will be less bacterial exposure when exposed to the air. Like, when you get a minor cut that draws a bit of blood but doesn't need a band-aid, you wash it and then leave it exposed. You don't rub dirt in it because there's way more bacteria in dirt than there is in the air, so it's way more likely to get infected if you do that. Being exposed also minimizes the radiation it's exposed to that could potentially generate radiocarbon from nitrogen atoms. Carbon-14 in the atmosphere is mostly produced at high altitudes and near the poles, where the magnetic field that protects us from cosmic radiation is weakest. So an exposed sample won't be impacted by the cosmic rays, but a buried sample has a very high chance of being close to uranium, as uranium is fairly ubiquitous in pretty much all types of rock and soil. It's small enough that it generally doesn't affect us out here in the atmosphere, but surround a sample with uranium-bearing rock and/or soil, and you will get the occasional nitrogen atom being hit and flipped into a carbon-14 atom.
If they would have been contaminated by C14, it would have been contaminated by other things, and therefore it would have contaminated the blood that we find in the bones, and the blood cells would be non-existent.
So, let me get this straight. If contamination by C14 were possible, some mysterious other things would also have contaminated the bone, and these other things would have destroyed the soft tissues? Like, that's not how contamination works. Different contaminants do their contaminating in different ways and under different circumstances. Does Matt think that when a produce company recalls some of their vegetables because of a listeria contamination, those vegetables must have been equally contaminated by literally everything that it is possible to contaminate something with? Of course that's not how it works. One form of contamination does not automatically mean that every other form of contamination has also taken place.
So you can look at this all sorts of different ways, and you can cross-reference these dinosaur findings, and just biologically, that's enough information for me to say, yes, God was right. Yes, the Bible is correct, that God created dinosaurs with man.
Does Matt even know what cross-referencing is? Because it's what I've been doing here, or if I'm honest, it's what the researchers that I've been citing have been doing, because if you actually read my sources, you'll find that a lot of them refer directly to each other. And what's more, some of them even go as far as referencing creationist material, then checking the references that the creationists used, and then going back to those sources to see if they said what the creationist claims that they said. And it's usually either something that is removed from context, or is only applicable in very specific situations that are irrelevant to what the creationist is using it for. So these papers and articles are not just cross-referencing each other, they're cross-referencing the creationist cross-references. It's cross-referenception up in here. Matt hasn't even provided a source for this claim, much less cross-reference that with any other source that supports it. I had to go digging for the creationist source making that claim because Matt couldn't even be bothered to show it.
The Bible says, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox." And many evolutionists for many years were laughing at this and saying that this is not a dinosaur, because we know that dinosaurs don't eat grass.
I'm sorry. I take full personal responsibility for what's coming here. You see, in part 4 of my response to Matt's Science Falsely So-Called video, I had a little chuckle at the fact that he said, "Behemoth eats grass like an ox," while simultaneously showing a clip of a dinosaur eating not grass. I then went on to explain how grass didn't evolve until about 10 million years after the dinosaurs went extinct. Unfortunately, because this was a very minor point that doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things, I wasn't as thorough as I probably should have been and wound up using an old source from before grass was found in late Cretaceous coprolite. Ever since then, Matt has gleefully repeated this as though the entire case for Behemoth not being a dinosaur rested on the non-existence of grass during the time of the dinosaurs, when in reality, that was nothing more than a quick jab. But since this is the only time when Matt has ever been right about a thing, he's latched onto it like a breastfeeding baby.
Well, one day some scientists had found some coprolites, dinosaur dung, and they analyzed it, and they found that dinosaurs actually did eat Grass.
As mentioned, it was from the late Cretaceous, which was just before the dinosaurs went extinct. It pushed the earliest date for the evolution of grasses back by about 10 million years, but by no means does this indicate that grass were the primary food source for any dinosaurs. Quite the contrary, the coprolite in question led researchers to conclude that that particular dinosaur fed indiscriminately on plant matter. Notably, the most significant aspect of this find was that it explains why some mammals from the time had teeth that seemed to be well adapted for grazing. When we thought that grass had not yet evolved, that was an oddity in search of an explanation. But now we know. The explanation is that grass did exist, so the adaptations for grazing made sense.
Check this article out. It says fossil dung reveals dinosaurs did graze grass. Textbooks have long taught that grasses did not become common until long after the dinosaurs died at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. Depicting dinosaurs munching on grass was considered by experts to be as foolish as showing prehistoric humans hunting dinosaurs with spears.
I don't think that it was. Again, this is not a scientific paper, this is a news article where the primary goal is to create engaging content that keeps visitors on the website long enough to see as many ads as possible rather than being 100% accurate, so some hyperbole is expected, but even before this discovery, grass was thought to have originated 10 million years after the dinosaurs. Humans didn't evolve until the first members of the Homo genus appeared about 2 to 3 million years ago. So with the old timeline for grass evolution, it would have been at least 10 million years out of place, a time frame for which it is plausible that some evolutionary precursors to grass could have existed, but we hadn't found any as of yet. But the humans would have been over 60 million years out of place, so showing humans alongside dinosaurs would definitely have been more ridiculous than showing grass with them, and even putting the hyperbole aside, what this amounts to is scientists were wrong about a thing, and then changed their position when presented with new evidence. That is a good thing. But all that is relatively beside the point. News articles gonna do what news articles do, after all. That's why I try to go directly to the peer-reviewed shit when possible.
The Bible says about the Brachiosaur, Behemoth, it says he moveth his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his stones are wrapped together.
Yep. Glad you included the part about his stones, because as we all learned while reading Shakespeare in high school, stones is a common euphemism for testicles. With that in mind, do you know what tail is a common euphemism for? I'll give you a hint. It's something that is very closely related to the stones. If, by some anti-miracle, you just haven't figured it out yet, it's a dick. This is a biblical dick joke.
The Bible is describing these dinosaurs, and it describes an animal that had a tail as big as a cedar tree.
Sorry, Matt. Gonna have to subtract some points for reading comprehension. At no point did that verse say anything about it being as big as a cedar tree. It said it moves like a cedar tree. And what's even better here is that the word that's translated as moves can also be translated as extends or makes stiff. So, do you know what body part is often euphemistically called a tail, but can extend and be made stiff while being closely associated with the testicles? It's not a tail, it's the dick. So what this verse is actually saying is that Behemoth has big muscly balls and gets boners that are stiff as a tree.
And theistic evolutionists who will compromise will say, well, that's an elephant that it's talking about. Well, excuse me, an elephant doesn't move its tail like a cedar tree.
No, but they sure do get big boners. Though stiff might not be the appropriate word for that, since elephants have prehensile penises that they can use for stuff like scratching their belly when the trunk doesn't reach. Wish I had a prehensile penis. But I actually think it was more probably a hippo. If we read the full description, which goes from verse 15 to verse 24, it doesn't end at the "he's really big" descriptors. It talks about some behavior, and not just the eating of grass. Verses 21 through 23 say, "Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened, he is confident though the Jordan rushes against his mouth." Now, there is some ambiguity about what plant lotus tree is actually referring to here, but all the likely candidates are rather small, and the water lily type thing that we think of when we say lotus today is definitely not something that a sauropod could lie under. Reeds are also not terribly tall, and this animal can shelter in the reeds. Reeds are basically just tall grasses, but like tall to a hippo, not a sauropod. And that describes behaviors that hippos engage in. Here's a hippopod hanging out in the reeds together, and here's a hippo lying under the lotus plant. Okay, maybe those aren't actually lotus plants, but it's in the same vein. So yeah, if you read the whole description, it may not be a hippo, it might be something else, but it's definitely not a sauropod as creationists claim.
It's clear that this creature had a gigantic
dick. Oh, sorry, he probably was going to say something else.
Tail, that it was huge. And so you can look and compare the tail of an elephant or the tail of a hippopotamus, as they will claim Behemoth was, with the tail of a brachiosaur.
Okay, that's great, but again, it doesn't say that it was as big as a tree. It says it could be made stiff like a tree. So show me a sauropod's dick and then we can talk.
And it's pretty obvious what the truth is on that.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty obvious that it's a biblical dick joke. Thank you for agreeing with me, Matt.
In the creation model, we believe in what's known as Noah's flood. But according to evolution, uniformitarianism is true.
Uniformitarianism is mostly true, but this is a false dichotomy. It isn't a choice between uniformitarianism and Noah's flood. It's not even a choice between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Geologists are perfectly happy to acknowledge the role that large-scale catastrophes can play in the geologic record, but for the most part, the deposition of sediments is a slow and gradual process.
And basically what uniformitarianism is the idea that everything slowly accumulates geologically, that all of the layers that you see outside and see like in the Grand Canyon, for example, are caused by local floods or just slow accumulation of rock layers over time.
I think that might be the record for the longest that Matt has gone without saying something mind-numbingly idiotic. Well done, Matt! I mean, it wasn't 100% accurate, but baby steps. We'll get you there eventually, Matty boy.
And we can also do some comparative analysis between a global flood and local floods and see which one is correct.
We can do that. And since you've already pointed out that not all deposition is flood deposition, but that there are some other types of layers that accumulate more slowly than floods, Noah's flood has already lost even by your own admission.
We actually find fossilized clams on the top of Mount Everest.
And that has nothing to do with the various rates of deposition in the various environments represented in the geologic record.
And they're in the closed position, which means they were catastrophically buried and then pushed up the mountain through rapid plate tectonics, catastrophic plate tectonics.
Being closed does not mean that they were catastrophically buried. It's not hard to push a dead clamshell closed. Being buried just a little bit would be enough to do it. And wouldn't it be super inconvenient for you if I were to play a clip of a clam burying itself right now? Yep, definitely won't be doing that. Wouldn't want to embarrass Matt after all. Oh, come on, you know I'm gonna do it. Here's the clip. But also, floods are not the only type of event that can catastrophically bury things. Underwater mudslides are a thing that can happen, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Matt, but they happen all the time without the entire planet being flooded. As to the catastrophic plate tectonics, creationist geologist John Baumgartner calculated that the amount of tectonic activity required by the creationist model of Noah's flood would have resulted in enough heat to completely vaporize 25 kilometers of water over the entire Earth. And in order to make things work, God would have had to have monkeyed with the laws of physics. So, for the evolutionary model, closed clams are explained by sometimes being in situations where they are closed after death, a thing that we know happens, followed by millions of years of slow continental movement that uplifted them to mountains, a process that we can see happening today. But for the creation model, it's necessary to break the laws of physics in order to prevent the floodwaters from turning Noah's Ark into an assortment of poached meats. You are welcome to believe in an event that requires the suspension of the laws of physics in order to work, but you don't get to pretend that such a belief is in any way scientific.
These clams were closed shut. They were sealed by something so powerful that they could not even open when they died.
I'm as powerful as Noah's flood! Not gonna let it go to waste.
Mount Everest is great evidence of Noah's flood because You're not going to get a mountain that big on this Earth unless a catastrophic event takes place.
Why not? Is this your incredibly dumb gravity erodes mountains faster than they grow argument? It is, isn't it? Okay, let's let him say it.
And if you get a mountain that huge, that means that the event must have happened very quickly, because mountains are actually eroding over time. Everything is going to erode flat over time. Mountains are eroding, hills are eroding.
Okay, maybe he's not going to put it that bluntly in this one. Perhaps this is another instance of him changing his tune slightly in response to my critiques. Yes, I'm keeping that take even though I said perhaps as though it's two different words. Fuck you. I'm not... One take. But yeah, this is still a really bad argument. Because, you see, while it is true that erosion is a thing that happens, it does not happen equally everywhere. Erosional rates vary depending on local conditions. The Himalayas are particularly difficult to study both due to physical inaccessibility and political considerations, but it actually appears as though erosion is a process that, somewhat counterintuitively, allows mountains to grow higher than they otherwise would. The continents are essentially floating on the mantle, and while the mantle is made out of solid material, it is hot enough and under high enough pressure that it behaves like a very viscous fluid when looked at on timeframes greater than a couple centuries. As such, the continents are effectively floating on the mantle. So for an example of how this can work, let's head upstairs to my tub. Gotta prepare for a bath. Oh, right, science. Yeah, so imagine this is a continent floating on the mantle. It's our reliable ship, the HMS Leftovers. Put heavy things in it, like some nice, sweet Canadian scratch. And you see how it's sitting lower in the mantle. No, you don't, because realistically, I'm only doing this in one take and I probably have it framed like shit. But yeah, just trust me, it is. I'll give you a loony if you trust me. Loony not good enough? Might have a toonie. I don't think I have a toonie. Patreon.com/ViceRhino. I didn't bring a towel. The same thing happens at large scales. The weight of the land... I know how jackets work. The weight of the landmass actually makes it sit lower in the mantle. If something happens to that landmass that decreases its weight, it will sit higher in the mantle. This process is known as isostatic rebound and is most commonly the result of glaciation. Big, massive chunk of ice sits on a landmass, pushing it down, ice melts, land pops back up. But the same applies to erosion. In fact, for some mountain ranges in temperate climates, it's estimated that about 25% of their height can be attributed to isostatic rebound resulting from erosion. In other words, the very erosional processes that you are describing make it possible for the mountains to grow even taller than they would just due to tectonic activity.
And yes, evolutionists make the claim that the plates are moving really slowly and that's what's forming the mountains.
Matt, do you deny that the tectonic plates move? Because that's a thing that demonstrably is happening and is precisely measured using GPS satellites. Hell, I don't even need to go to secular evolutionist sources like the USGS. Andrew Snelling, a creationist geologist, when writing for Answers in Genesis, said the idea that continents move sounds crazy until you look at the facts. In that article, he goes over how we know that tectonic activity is happening today, and only talks about the flood for a couple of paragraphs at the very end, claiming that this is when the crust of the Earth first broke into the tectonic plates that we can see moving today. So, once again, Matt is showing himself to be so bad at creationisting that I can prove him wrong using other creationists.
Look, gravity is going to pull those mountains down faster than they can be brought up by plate tectonics.
Oh, damn, there it is. Should have just let him talk a bit longer. Technically, since buoyancy is a gravitational force, and buoyancy is responsible for isostatic rebound, which is a significant factor in increasing the height of mountain ranges, then gravity is actually what makes it possible for the mountains to get as tall as they do. So Matt isn't just wrong here, he is exactly wrong.
If the plates are only moving 1 to 2 inches per year and slowly changing the landscape, That's not going to create something like this. It's not going to create any mountain.
Why not? Do you plan on justifying that statement in any way at all?
In fact, everything would just be flat everywhere.
God damn it, Matt. No, it obviously wouldn't. So for example, if we take continent llama, continent bear, smush them together, they crash into each other. Oh, you see how they went up? I was kind of hoping the bear's butt would go up so we could have Mount Bear Bottom, but we got Mount Bear Llama Kiss Hug thing.
So mountains are great evidence of Noah's flood. A well-preserved whale fossil has been discovered on a California mountain. The nearly intact fossil of a whale has been unearthed at a construction site in Santa Cruz County.
Well, at least this time he's not showing screenshots of articles published on Talk Origins that explicitly debunk the claims that he's making. But yeah, whale on mountain is just as much of a non-problem for evolutionists as clams on Everest. It was on the seafloor, then tectonic activity uplifted it to a mountain. And this doesn't really matter, but isn't it Santa Cruz, not Santa Cruz? Like, I know I'm not someone that should be commenting on other people's pronunciation. Me saying things wrong is kind of a running joke on my channel, but Santa Cruz is a really easy one to get right, even for us gringos.
After reading this, the question then becomes, how does a whale get to the top of a mountain?
Actually, my question is, why do you know the answer for clams but not the whale? It's the same answer.
The only explanation is that the whale was catastrophically buried in Noah's flood.
No, it's not, because floods take sediments from high places and move them to low places, not the other way around. The only answer is plate tectonics. You just don't think they can happen slowly for some reason. Apparently, it's only possible for plate tectonics to operate at speeds that have been determined by creationists to be impossible without divine intervention. But continuing to operate at speeds that we see them operating today for long periods of time? Just completely unthinkable and impossible.
You find sea life on every single mountain. That's why you find clams on mountains that are in the closed position, because we're talking about catastrophic processes that placed these organisms there.
Is he seriously backtracking his earlier support for catastrophic plate tectonics? It sounds like he's saying they all died on the mountaintops now, rather than on the seafloor, followed by the tectonic uplift.
We also find trees that go through millions of years of geologic time.
No, we don't. We find creationists not understanding the fact that different depositional environments deposit sediment at different rates, which is weird because that is a trivially easy thing to understand. A volcanic eruption puts down a layer of ash way faster than the slow accumulation of coccolithophore exoskeletons on a calm seafloor.
That means that these layers are not millions of years old.
No, it doesn't. Hell, even if I grant that the layers formed as quickly as Matt is suggesting in one single flood event, it says nothing to their overall age. The whole shebang could still be millions of years old, even if it only took 1 year to form. Like, my house is nearly 100 years old, but it was built in probably less than 2 years. The fact that it only took 2 years to build doesn't mean that it can't be a century old. But that's granting too much, because there's no way the layers of the Grand Canyon formed in 1 year in one worldwide flood.
That they didn't take that much time to accumulate, that what actually caused them to accumulate was rapid succession of layers being laid down by water.
Rapid succession of layers being laid down? Yes. By water? Not necessarily. Sometimes it was, but other times it was volcanic activity. Also, rapid doesn't mean what Matt needs it to mean. Some of them could have been formed in a single event, like a flood or an eruption, but there could also be some layers that are the result of slower deposition on the order of decades or even centuries, like peat accumulation. That is still geologically rapid, but unfortunately for Matt, it doesn't fit in with a single flood event. And that's not even getting into the fact that a single flood event would not form multiple layers, but would in fact form a single thick conglomerate layer.
And this had to have been the case because trees, when they die, they fall over.
Sometimes not for a few hundred years, during which things like floods and volcanic eruptions can and do happen, but yeah, eventually they will.
Well, what tree is going to stand for millions of years as layers slowly accumulate around it?
No tree is going to do that. Good thing nobody says that they did. Like, that's why these trees are only ever found in the types of layers that accumulate relatively quickly. But I guess in order to figure that out, you'd have to actually, read about it and understand what you're reading. Gross.
So these polystratofossils, which is what they're called, is some of the greatest evidence of Noah's flood.
No, they're not, and they're only called polystrate fossils by creationists, and that's polystrate, not polystrata. To actual scientists, they're usually known as either T0 assemblages or upright fossil trees.
And of the fact that layers don't take millions of years to form. The Grand Canyon's layers did not take millions of years of rainfall.
It's more than a bit disingenuous to jump from upright fossil trees and the layers surrounding them to the Grand Canyon. Upright fossil trees are almost exclusively found in strata that indicate low-lying wetlands. There are almost none from any other climate. And this is precisely because the types of layers that can form fast enough without just knocking the trees over are more likely to form in those environments as well. The Grand Canyon, however, represents dozens of entire environments and ecosystems, and to the best of my knowledge, it does not contain any T0 assemblages.
It took one gigantic, catastrophic event.
And that one gigantic catastrophic event somehow laid down sediment that indicates both shallow marine environments and arid desert environments at exactly the same time. Sure sounds reasonable to me.
And some skeptics will say that little local floods could cause these layers to form around the trees.
Oh, we're back at the trees, are we? Dude is obviously reading from notes, but somehow can't stop himself from getting distracted by irrelevant bits. Yes, small local floods can rapidly deposit layers, and that is one type of event that can do so around the base of a tree without destroying that tree.
Well, whatever created these fossils had to have been so catastrophic, because the trees, many of them, are upside down.
Oh god, this again. Last time Matt mentioned this, I searched long and hard for a source for this claim, and it always seems to come back to Ian Juby or Harold Coffin. Juby is a hack who doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. His arguments are almost as bad as Matt's. But Harold Coffin is more respectable. Would that be the word to use here? He's respectable among creationists. I've searched again, and once again, they are pretty much all I can find. Coffin does seem to be the ultimate origin of this claim as far as I can tell, and he only makes a passing mention of such trees in his book, not really tying much significance to them, and even explaining himself that it wouldn't be unusual for a log to get stuck on a beach in such an orientation during a local flood, meaning that the existence of the occasional upside-down tree would not be unexpected. But unless there's some scientific term that creationists are once again obscuring that I'm just unaware of, it seems as though such finds are exceptionally rare, if not completely non-existent.
Obviously, some of these trees were ripped out by literal earthquakes, and they floated around for a while, became waterlogged, went upside down into these layers that were still soft, and then all of those layers solidified around them, and the tree and the layers together became fossilized in one event.
But then, why is it only trees, or for the pedants in the audience, tree-like lycopods? And why is it that in T0 assemblages, evidence of plants beginning to grow and animals making burrows and stuff can be found in nearly every layer around the tree? How does that happen if they're the result of one single massive flooding event that killed everything in it?
This I find interesting. It says the monkeys that sailed across the Atlantic to South America.
Oh, are we gonna get the surfing monkeys again? It really is weird to me, knowing that Matt watches my videos, to see which points he changes based on my responses and which he just keeps around. In this case, the main problem with Matt's position here is that it doesn't matter whether we're looking at things from a perspective of geologic time and evolution or Noah's flood. The problem remains the same. How did monkeys get to South America? And in fact, the problem is worse for creationists. You see, creationists and the people who accept science all agree that the continents were joined into a supercontinent in the past. But for creationists, the continents broke apart during the flood that wiped out all life. So they have to answer the question of how did such and such get to this location for literally every type of plant and animal that exists anywhere that isn't directly connected to the Middle East. But in the evolutionary model, there were plants and animals on these continents when they split millions of years ago, so for the most part, the plants and animals that live there are simply the descendants of the ones who were there when they split. The only time we have to answer the question of how an animal or a plant got there is when we find something that is clearly out of place. In this case, molars were found that are consistent with a group of African primates that would have been out of place for South American primates. Since rafting is a thing that happens sometimes, even today, and since the time during which these primates would have had to arrive in South America was also a time when South America was significantly closer to Africa, rafting is a plausible hypothesis for how they could have gotten there. Notably, Scientists are often accused by creationists of suppressing evidence that would support creationism and twisting the evidence that they don't suppress to make it seem to fit the evolutionary picture better than it otherwise would. So, what happened here? They didn't need to publish findings that indicated the African primates were found in South America. If there was some big scientific conspiracy to suppress anything that doesn't support evolution, and this find would indeed fail to support evolution, then they could have just labeled them as a new species of South American primate and moved on. The fact that the question of how those primates got there even came up is itself evidence that no such conspiracy exists. Even more so if the only possible explanation seems ridiculous. After all, why pose a difficult question that needs answering if your goal is just to publish information that supports the answer you already decided on? Well, in the case of science, it's because we actually want to learn new things, to understand the world and how we got here, how things work, etc. A difficult question is exciting to scientists. The more difficult the question, the more important the answering of that question will be in the history books. There is no significance in pushing conclusions that have already been decided on in advance, which is why creationists are ultimately doomed. Eventually, when their movement finally fizzles out, they will be nothing more than a quirk of history, a study in the psychology of belief. Not that I think all fare much better in the history books. Best I can hope for is in a couple hundred years some rando will stumble onto this video, hear me say that, and think to himself, this guy was a bit prescient, before going back to living their normal life and never giving me another thought. Hi rando from 200 years in the future. Has Tesla finally rolled out actual full self-driving yet, or is it still just glorified cruise control?
Monkeys suddenly appeared in South America about 40 million years ago. Unlikely though it may seem, they probably sailed there from Africa. Prehistoric monkeys traveled 900 miles between continents on rafts. The reason that atheists will promote this idea that monkeys surfed from Africa to South America is because they're trying to explain how monkey fossils got to South America.
Yes, people propose explanations in order to explain the thing that the explanation explains. Congratulations on figuring that out. The reason I told my partner that I couldn't get it up was because I just couldn't stop thinking about that scene in Deadpool and Wolverine where Wolverine chops off the tip of Deadpool's penis with his claws, was in order to explain why I couldn't get it up. Explanations explain things. Brilliant sleuthing, Matt.
Well, number one, you find a fossil in South America. You can't just conclude that monkeys surfed over there.
They didn't. Nobody said that they surfed. I'm sure you probably could find a news article that used hyperbolic language like that if you tried, but so far the only sources that you've even shown say they rafted. Not sure if you're aware of this, Matt, but sitting on a raft is very different from surfing.
I mean, even if they were, they still got buried and killed.
Everything dies eventually. Did you think that we thought that they were immortal monkeys? Are there immortal monkeys in South America? Is that the real solution to how you get monkeys to type out the works of Shakespeare? You don't need infinite monkeys, you just need one monkey with infinite time. Well, I for one welcome our new immortal monkey overlords.
And this looks more to me like Noah's flood was actually the cause of these findings, because to get a fossil, you have to have rapid burial. And not only that, if you're finding monkey fossils in places where they're not supposed to be, the flood is what would shuffle up all of this biology and put it in all sorts of different places for us to find later.
Okay, sure, whatever. But how did the monkeys that are supposed to be in South America get there after the flood, Matt? How'd they do it? We've both got the same problem here, but one of us has a lot more time for it to be solved than the other.
And so Noah's flood is what put these fossils there. It's not that the monkeys surfed across the ocean 34 million years ago. It's that God allowed the earth to be flooded because of the wickedness of man.
God murdered a bunch of monkeys because of the wickedness of man. Sounds legit.
And God decided to start over with Noah and his family.
Yay! Incest! Don't clip that. Please.
And that's totally fine. That's up to God.
And there you have it. Straight from Matt's pretty little Why'd I write that in the script? Ugh. Genocide, followed by repopulation via incest, is perfectly fine, according to Matt.
We shouldn't consider ourselves smarter than God or have an issue with God for wiping out the planet.
Well, that's kind of the crux here, isn't it? If a God exists, it is almost definitely smarter than I am. I'm just some idiot YouTuber after all, but I am way smarter than the idiot that God is portrayed as in the Bible. He regularly throws temper tantrums that have massive death tolls. So if God exists, it ain't the Christian God because that dude's an idiot.
He did it once. He could do it again if he wanted to.
Didn't he promise not to? Well, I mean, he specifically promised not to do it with water again, so technically he could use anything else and that'd be fine? Yay! Divine loopholes that allow God to go on genocidal sprees whenever it tickles his fancy. Such a good God that we should worship.
Via fire, and the Bible even tells us that he will.
Right, guess I cut in too soon there. Matt, you worship a genocidal maniac, and you are saying as much here. If your moral compass is so broken that that's okay to you, then you're probably beyond hope.
The Bible says the elements will melt with a fervent heat. God does have wrath towards people who hate him.
You know, some hippie once said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." That hippie was Jesus Harold Christ. What you are saying here, Matt, is that human beings are being held to higher expectations than the all-powerful, all-knowing God of the universe. Jesus, who you believe was God, said that having anger and wrath for those who hate you is petty. To be perfect is to love everyone, treat everyone well, regardless of how they feel about you. To be fair, he did kind of undercut that whole point when he talked about hell, or said that you have to hate your family in order to follow him, but still, the point remains that if God is allowed to be angry and wrathful at those who hate him, but we aren't, then that means that he has placed unreasonably high expectations on humans, making his judgment against us unjust even by his own metrics.
You shouldn't hate your creator. You should love your creator.
Well, then maybe my creator should do something to make himself worthy of love. The act of creation does not in and of itself justify love for the creator.
They claim that dinosaurs once crossed oceans.
Crossing oceans is a bit of a stretch here. They found hadrosaurs in northern Africa. Hadrosaurs, before this find, were thought to be limited to Europe, Asia, and North America. At the time the hadrosaurs lived, Pangaea had split into the two continents of Laurasia and Gondwana. The location of this particular find suggests that the hadrosaurs had somehow managed to cross the Tethys Sea that separated those two continents. At its widest, the Tethys was about half the width of the widest part of the Atlantic, between 2,000 and 3,000 kilometers. But the hadrosaur dispersal would have happened across a much shorter distance of about 500 kilometers. Not only was it a relatively short distance, they were possibly aided by numerous islands along the way. But also, as the paper that's being cited by the article that Matt is showing points out, we know of several instances of animals colonizing locations that required them to cross sometimes vast distances in water. Hadrosaurs had adaptations that likely would have made them stronger swimmers than most modern mammals, including polar bears, which have been observed on at least one occasion to swim a distance of over 600 kilometers. But even if they weren't strong swimmers, hippos, which despite their aquatic lifestyle are actually terrible swimmers, managed to cross the Mozambique Channel, which at its narrowest is more than 300 kilometers wide, in order to get to Madagascar. So the idea that some animals crossed a relatively wide channel is not really that far of a stretch.
They say the first duck-billed dinosaur fossil was discovered in Africa, so again, you have an instance where dinosaur fossils are found out of place.
No, this isn't out of place. This is in an unexpected place. Out of place would be more along the lines of finding a fossil of a modern-looking dog in 500-million-year-old Cambrian rock. Finding an animal in a new location, but in a time where they are known to have existed, is not terribly groundbreaking. I mean, it's insightful and provides us with valuable data when it comes to reconstructing ancient ecosystems, but it doesn't rock the evolutionary boat.
What do we believe? Do we believe they surfed over there, or do we believe that Noah's flood put these fossils in these positions?
As I pointed out last time, nobody is saying that they surfed there. Surfing is not the same as swimming, drifting, and rafting. So the real question is, do we believe that they did a thing which we've seen animals do on occasion? Or do we believe in a clearly mythological story that the ancient Hebrews adapted from earlier Sumerian myths?
Noah's flood is the explanation for all of these things, and if you don't believe in Noah's flood, then this is what you're left with. You have to believe stuff like this, and I want to encourage you to be rational and logical and not believe things that are based in lies.
Yeah, I know. It's so irrational of me to believe that animals in the past could do some things that animals in the present have been observed doing. But hey, I gotta stick with this irrational explanation if I want to continue in my sinful ways, right? Like, my ability to do butt stuff is directly linked to my beliefs about how a hadrosaur got from Laurasia to Gondwana, after all.
And some biological organisms are so unique from others that even Darwinists will claim that they could not have evolved by Darwinian means.
You mean the Darwinification of the Darwinian Darwinism didn't Darwinize Darwinly? My Darwin, we may just have to re-Darwin this whole Darwin thing.
And so squids and octopi are some of those creatures that many claim could not have evolved, so they have to explain how they got here.
Oh, I know where this is going. Many, in this case, is the single team of researchers who proposed in 2018 that cephalopod DNA arrived on Earth via fertilized octopus eggs traveling through space via meteorite. To the rest of the relevant scientific community, this paper is summed up nicely by a statement made by the curator of the Oxford Museum of Natural History, Mark Carnall. This paper is firmly pseudoscience and nonsense. I'm not 100% convinced it isn't a hoax it's that deliberately bad. When it comes to cephalopods, at best, it's the flimsiest of hypotheses propped up by a misreading of a handful of references with little in the way of justification for why these hypotheses are important. Okay, now with that out of the way, go ahead and tell me that one poorly written paper that was nearly universally lampooned by the scientific community is what everyone who accepts evolution has to believe.
And in this paper here, in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, it states this, that it's plausible then to suggest that they seem to be borrowed from a far distant future, quote unquote, in terms of terrestrial evolution, or more realistically from the cosmos at large.
Yep, that's the paper. What justification do they use for that conclusion? Essentially none. Their line of reasoning is based on one other study that looked at the genetics of 12 individual organisms, with only one octopus getting a full genome sequencing, everything else being fragmentary. From this, they saw that there are some differences between the RNA modification sites in those 12 organisms as compared to some distantly related organisms. Therefore, fertilized eggs from space are responsible! If that seems like a massive and unjustified jump in logic to you, that's because it is. Matt finally cites an actual paper rather than a news article, and it's one that is universally dismissed as unreasonable, unevidenced, pseudoscientific nonsense. Also, the primary author on that paper seems to be the kind of hack who just likes to conclude that anything even remotely unexplained just bamfed its way to Earth from space. He published a paper in 2020 that concluded that COVID-19 came from space. In that same paper, he also heavily implies, while avoiding saying directly, that HIV and Spanish flu also came from space. So yeah, everything's from space. All of it.
So what they're claiming is that octopi and squid are so unique that they couldn't have evolved, so they must be aliens. And the theory is that they rode through the atmosphere on a comet, which would have toasted them.
Yep. That's the theory. It's actually weird that they landed on actual octopus eggs being on the comet rather than retroviruses, given that they talk about retroviruses playing a key role in their hypothesis in other parts of the paper. Because honestly, the idea that a retrovirus could survive interplanetary or interstellar travel, frozen in ice on a comet, and then successfully be revived once that comet hits a planet, is way more plausible than their actual claim of fertilized octopus eggs doing the same. I mean, you'd still have the problem of just how unlikely it would be for extraterrestrial genetics to be in any way compatible with terrestrial genetics in the first place, but at least there is precedent for extremophiles from Earth being able to survive in space. Cephalopods are so notoriously difficult to raise in captivity and even more difficult to breed that the idea of their eggs surviving in the much more harsh conditions provided by outer space is just downright ludicrous.
It's much easier to say that God created them.
Well, we dealt with this more in the first video, but it is worth restating. Being easier to say does not mean it is more likely to be true. And actually, honestly, octopuses came from space is significantly easier to say than God created them and then somehow protected them from the physically impossible worldwide flood that he used to wipe out all land creatures. So in this case, you don't even win the syntactic simplicity side of the argument.
Actually, it takes rational thought to understand that God created them. Some people actually think that dinosaurs farted themselves to death.
We have reached the age of the dinosaurs with volcanoes and tar pits and primeval forests, but how could such huge and powerful creatures have all disappeared? Dad, is that why they call it extinction? Huh, what do you know? This book aimed at prepubescent children does say that dinosaurs farted themselves to death. I mean, it also says that the universe farted itself into existence, that land animals evolved in order to escape a fish fart, and that the end of the Ice Age was because of a mammoth farting, but hey, learn something new every day.
No joke, you can look it up.
Yeah, no, that's not what the paper says. I mean, that is what the news article says, because news articles gonna do what news articles do. They'll get more clicks for dinosaurs farted themselves to extinction than dinosaur farts may have contributed to the Mesozoic being warm. But if you read the paper, that is the conclusion. Given an assumed number of herbivores, and given what we know of metabolism, it is possible that herbivore metabolism is responsible for 2 to 4 parts per million of methane in the atmosphere of the time, which is enough to impact the climate. That's all it is. Extinction is mentioned a grand total of once in the whole paper. And it's not even about dinosaurs when it mentions it. It's about how humans driving megafauna to extinction corresponded with a global decrease of methane levels, thus supporting the idea that more animals producing more gases can increase methane levels. That's all they were saying.
It is really wild. I actually called some people out on that who were saying that to others. There was a group of people, I think it was RT, they said that this somehow proves that the Creation Museum is ridiculous and creation science is false.
I mean, the Creation Museum is ridiculous, and creation science is false, and the data that was used in the dinosaur farting paper to arrive at its conclusions certainly is a part of what proves that to be the case. But I doubt very much that some group called RT used the news article that you are showing as the basis for the claim that creationism is ridiculous and false. That just, I don't know. I have a hard time believing that one. Screenshots or it didn't happen.
Because dinosaurs passed too much gas and killed themselves off with their own flatulence.
Sounds like Matt's been huffing too much Jenkum. Take it easy with that stuff, buddy. I know it can give you a sense of euphoria, but it comes with a very real risk of brain damage. Which would explain a lot, actually.
Some of these theories are really wild, and some people do actually believe them.
Some people believe that Jewish space lasers start wildfires. Some people believe that reptiles in human costumes rule the Earth. Some people believe that the Earth is flat. Some people believing a goofy thing does not have any bearing on the truth of evolution.
And in this kid's book, you can see here it says, question, are chickens related to the T-Rex? Answer, yes. Science has revealed compelling evidence that the T-Rex actually evolved into a chicken.
Matt, I implore you, please, ask yourself why you had to go to a children's book for that. I can find you a kid's book that says all sorts of stupid shit. Hell, let's flip this. In this kid's book, you can see here that it says that Jesus went to John the Baptist to have his sins washed away. So according to this kid's book, Jesus had sins that needed to be washed away before he could begin his ministry. So clearly, Matt believes that Jesus was a sinner because this kid's book says so. So, chicken and T-Rex. No, the chicken is not a descendant of the T-Rex. Yes, the chicken and the T-Rex are related. All living things are related, so that's kind of a no-brainer. Now, is the chicken the T-Rex's closest living relative? I doubt it's the closest, but whatever it is, it will be a bird of some kind, because birds are theropod dinosaurs. T-Rex was also a theropod dinosaur, but that's a big category that contained a lot of diversity. But it wasn't too long ago that a group of birds called the terror birds existed. They were basically mini T-Rexes, bigger than humans, but smaller than the T-Rex, and they are unquestionably birds. If you can't see how those things could be related to other non-avian theropods, then that's a you problem, buddy.
So from Jurassic Park's worst monster to lunch at KFC, that's what they think.
Okay, first and foremost, Jurassic Park's worst monster was obviously the Velociraptor, not the T-Rex. But no, that was what one children's author thinks, and what they think is not in line with the scientific consensus, so that is not what we all think.
They literally think that chickens are descendants of dinosaurs. And some of them will say, well, every bird in the sky is a dinosaur.
Well, yeah, that part is true. Chickens, and all other birds, are not just descended from dinosaurs, they are theropod dinosaurs themselves. It's just a matter of cladistics.
Let's go ahead and get back on track.
He says that as though he didn't come prepared with supplemental material and screenshots of children's books for what he is now pretending was an off-the-cuff tangent. God, what kind of loser scripts out every moment of his video, including the off-topic tangents, and then pretends when he's recording that it was an accidental diversion? What an idiotic thing to do. I'd never stoop to such things, of course. Nope. Not me.
So in the creation model, we believe that mankind was designed, but in evolution they teach that humans descended from primates.
And to reiterate, humans are primates by definition. So if you descended from humans, congratulations! You also descended from primates, because that's what those words mean. You might not like those definitions, but that just makes you wrong.
And I don't have long to get into this because this is kind of just a basic seminar. It has a lot of basics in it.
Indeed, Matt. Ya basic.
We don't really go super deep into any of these topics, though we could.
No, you couldn't. I've seen you try to do deep dives on things. Never goes well for you.
But I'd like to point out that it's very rational to understand that two humans conceived the world's population.
Well, given that genetic research has shown the minimum viable population size for mammals is somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 individuals, yes, it is irrational to believe that the whole human population originated with just 2 individuals.
And that we didn't descend from primates.
Again, we are primates, so even if your little Adam and Eve story were true, we descended from the primates called Adam and Eve.
And some people are now claiming that one of our earliest ancestors was a jellyfish.
I doubt it. It's more likely that the claim is that one of our earliest ancestors was a jellyfish-like creature, because modern jellyfish weren't around long enough ago for us to have been descended from them. Though there has been some evidence to suggest that comb jellies rather than sponges are the sister group to all other animals. My guess is that at this point, Matt is simply going to point out that he thinks that sounds rather silly, therefore it can't possibly be true, because reality itself must bend to adhere to the things that Matt himself is capable of believing. Like, just imagine being so self-absorbed that upon learning of something that you thought sounds impossible but is very heavily supported by evidence, rather than taking even a moment to consider the fact that your prior evaluation might have been wrong, you insist that, no, I can't be wrong, it's reality that's wrong. Not even C.S. motherfucking Lewis, who intentionally wrote the main characters of his book to be as bland and one-dimensional as possible in order to make the story about Aslan and Narnia rather than the actual characters, didn't stoop to that level. If Matt Powell wrote Narnia, then when Peter and Susan finally make it through the wardrobe, they just look around, say, oh, that's impossible, and then head right back out again. Book over, turns out Narnia wasn't real in the first place.
What do they teach in schools these days?
What makes more sense? Come on. That a jellyfish conceived all of mankind over time? That somehow a family of jellyfish turned into a family of people over a bunch of successive generations? Or that 2 people conceived the world population?
Again, your personal incredulity aside, the jellyfish. Along with the earlier caveat about modern jellyfish not being literally the thing that is the ancestor to all animals. And this conclusion is because of that same minimal viable population size thing. And honestly, if you're going to go reductio ad absurdum, I can do better than you. Jellyfish had descendants that were all a little bit different from their parents, which over countless generations spanning hundreds of millions of years led to the diversity of modern animal life, is way more believable than cosmic sorcerer who existed before anything spoke, despite there being no medium to carry sound waves, and that speech magically created everything, including the sorcerer's arch nemesis, the talking snake. So the sorcerer planted a tree that he didn't want anyone to touch in the middle of a garden where it would be easily accessible. Then he made a guy out of dirt and told him not to touch the tree. Then he made a woman out of the piece of the man, but didn't tell her to not touch the tree. So when the talking snake told her to eat some of that obviously yummy fruit, she did, which made the sorcerer angry. So he kicked both of them out of the garden, otherwise they'd be able to eat from the live forever tree, and that, combined with eating from the first tree, would make them equally powerful sorcerers. And we all know that sorcerers hate competition, but eventually it bummed the sorcerer out that he wouldn't get to hang out with the people he created, so he impregnated a teenager, became his own son, and killed himself so that people who believe in him can come and live with him after they die. Yeah, That's what you believe. That's literally what you believe. Also, no word on why living forever after death doesn't count as being a god, but living forever by eating the fruit while you're alive does.
Adam and Eve were real people who actually existed in the past.
Now, do you have any evidence to support that? Aside from your already stated, I find this story to be easier to believe than the well-evidenced findings of generations of the most highly educated people on the planet? Or are we just going along with the intuition of someone who is so consistently idiotic that they are the only person I've ever dedicated a montage of idiocy to?
But in space, wouldn't it be a different scenario based on the fact that, the space and the air in the space is much different than the air we have here?
They believe that rocks evolved, that you had smaller rocks that somehow morphed into larger rocks.
That out of his mouth go burning lamps and sparks of fire leap out. The dinosaurs they've discovered have, the dragons they've discovered have chambers in the back of their head. It's where they can breathe fire. But that's just a couple things. I mean,
If it's about survival of the fittest and we evolved from African Americans into other Americans, what about the African Americans that are still alive today?
well, I don't see anything wrong with quote mining. I believe if we study history, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls.
T-Rex, they had short, stubby arms. And apparently now the chicken's able to do a handstand with those arms.
Think about this. We have more in common genetically in certain areas with a gorilla than with an ape. Yet they say genetically we evolved from apes. We can tell based on genetics.
Honestly, John, I don't know a ton of technical terms. I'm very simple when it comes to science. I just enjoy simple science.
And the alternative to Adam and Eve is the assertion that biological organisms somehow came alive in the water. Remember, water destroys them.
Yeah, I'm gonna refer you back to the first video in the series for my more detailed response to that, but for now, suffice it to say that Matt just seems completely unaware of the fact that drinking water is a thing that living things do all the damn time, because water is actually necessary for life as we know it.
But even if we enter into fantasy land and pretend that it's true, that water created this organic material that turned into life, and all of this life started to diversify, mutations would have killed these organisms before they could have even diversified.
Mutations are literally one of the diversification mechanisms, so no.
They teach in evolution that we mutated from a single-celled organism to humans over time.
Not in so simplistic a fashion, but yes. Honestly, the way you said it is more akin to the reproductive process. When a sperm meets an egg, it forms a single cell. Then, over the course of 9 months, that one cell evolves into a fully blown human being. Matt seems incredulous at the idea that a single cell could ever become a human being, but it happens all the damn time. And it happens so easily that people spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars per year in order to avoid it happening.
Mutations are the reasons for cancer, Down syndrome, and autism. Sickle cell anemia.
Fun fact about cancer being caused by mutations is that if we're looking at the individual cells, the mutations are a sequence of 3 to 6 mutations that have to happen in that cell's evolutionary lineage, and the mutations serve to make that cell capable of near unlimited reproduction and immortality. In other words, cancer is almost an evolutionary atavism, where an individual cell puts itself back in time before multicellular organisms when it had to compete for resources with the other cells around it. And since all the cells around it are part of a cohesive multicellular organism, the cancerous cells survive by cheating the system. What I'm saying here is that cancer is an evolutionary microcosm. The interesting thing about the cause of Down syndrome is that our study of Down syndrome has actually led directly to progression in cancer research. Down syndrome occurs when an individual has an extra copy of chromosome 21. When genes are overexpressed, it can have a drastic change on a person's body, but figuring out which genes are responsible for which changes is a tricky business because there are so many interactions between the various genes and so many steps between the gene being expressed and the effect being studied. With Down syndrome, there's a whole chromosome that will pretty much definitionally be overexpressed. So eventually, researchers realized that people with Down syndrome have significantly lower rates of cancer. This realization led to the discovery that several genes, when overexpressed, have a protective effect against cancer. As for autism, I'm still fairly new to the personal experience aspect of autism, having one child that was just diagnosed this year, and another that is going through the process, but the doctor wants to get their ADHD symptoms managed before getting the screening done. And yes, just as a disclaimer, they have both given me permission to talk about it. The cause of autism isn't as cut and dried as it was a mutation. There almost certainly is a genetic factor. In fact, there is certainly a genetic factor, but there are also environmental factors at play as well. But genetic causes aside, let's look at the implication of what he's saying here. Evolution can't happen because mutations cause cancer. Cancer is literally your own body evolving to outcompete itself, and on top of that, it usually happens as a result of mutations that happen during a person's lifetime, rather than an embryonic mutation making them more susceptible to cancer, though that certainly plays a role as well. But what this means is that, in most cases, cancer doesn't happen until after the person who gets it has already passed their reproductive prime. They've already had their babies, and likely raised them to a point where they have babies of their own now. As far as evolution is concerned, it's done with you. No need to continue improving on that. All it needs is for you to have had babies that have had babies, and you've done that. So why should it bother to select against rogue cells seeking immortality for themselves? So far from being a problem for evolution, cancer is almost certainly an expected outcome of evolution. That aside, looking at the rest of what you said here, it essentially boils down to people with Down syndrome and autistic people may as well be dead. And as the parent of at least one autistic kid, that's a fucking gross thing to say, Matt. And of course, then there's sickle cell anemia, a mutation that became the poster child of beneficial mutations, as having one copy of the sickle cell gene protects against malaria. So that's evolution in action, I guess. How's that evidence against evolution?
All these things are caused by mutations.
Yep, and as easy as it would have been to find exclusively detrimental mutations if you knew the first thing about looking shit up, you couldn't even avoid listing mutations that have obvious benefits, like surviving malaria, or in the case of autism, potentially inventing civilization in the first place. Like, seriously. I know it's kind of a meme, but have you ever seen an autistic person focus on something that spins, particularly things like gears as they turn it over and over, watching how they all interact together, linking the cause to the effect? Officially, this is just a guess on my part, but I'm like 99% certain that pretty much every major invention came from someone on the spectrum. I just can't picture a neurotypical person getting obsessed enough with gears and mechanisms to figure out how to invent a clock, or an Archimedes screw, or, obviously, trains. Can't forget trains. Anyway, I'm not the first person to have this realization, not by a long stretch. There's a whole ass book about this exact thing, written by one of the psychologists who's been on the forefront of autism research his entire career, Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen. My point was just that you picked really bad examples. Like, just look some stuff up. And go past the first result for once.
Mutations are what cause death.
So do infections, which is why mutating yourself up an immune system was evolutionarily advantageous.
Ultimately, we will die from mutations if we live long enough as humans.
Probably not directly, but yeah, basically. Weird how God couldn't have made us more like our jellyfish cousins, some of whom have the ability to regenerate into the juvenile stage, beginning their entire life cycle again, and potentially being immortal. I guess God just loves jellies more than he loves us.
But according to Darwinists, mutations are what cause us to evolve. It's what makes us better.
Nuance, Matt. Fucking nuance. Have you heard of it? It's a hell of a thing. Not all mutations are created equal, believe it or not. There's more to it than just mutation bad.
Because beneficial mutations get selected, and those beneficial mutations benefit populations more and more and more and more, and so those organisms become better in its survival of the fittest. The fittest organisms will reproduce and create even more fit organisms.
Oh, look, he actually kinda gets it. Yes, beneficial mutations are the ones that help an organism achieve reproductive success, which is what is generally meant by fitness when talking in evolutionary terms. If a mutation increases fitness, it has a higher chance of spreading through a population. If it decreases fitness, it has a lower chance.
Well, that's not true.
Oh, fuck!
Mutations aren't going to make us evolve from a frog to a prince.
I don't understand how he is so stupid. Like, he clearly understands it well enough to explain it, sort of, but then he just finishes with, "Nuh-uh, that bad," before reducing it down to his normal incoherent babble.
Or from rocks to man.
Again, I covered this one earlier, but we evolved from rocks in the same sense that we are still rocks today. That is, there are some components that our bodies need in order to function that can be found in rocks, like sodium and iron. We have to eat those things in order to live. Our evolutionary ancestors also needed at least some of those things. So if you get to say that you think we evolved from rocks because of that, then I get to say that you think that we're still made out of rocks. Although, that said, with the whole God making Adam out of dirt thing, that's actually closer to what you actually believe than what you're saying is to what I believe. You believe some weird shit.
That's just not how it works.
Well, on that point we agree.
That's not how biology works. That's not how science works.
Right. Science does not work by dismissing things offhandedly because a misinterpretation of the thing sounds silly if you don't actually think about it. That's a good thing.
Science shows us that everything produces after its kind.
No, it doesn't, because in order to do that, you'd have to actually define kind. That is something that no creationist has been able to do thus far. They have to keep changing their definition depending on what they're responding to, which is one of the hallmarks of an unscientific definition that is used for polemic purposes rather than investigative purposes.
And that organisms will reproduce other organisms that still remain in the family.
Incest is best, keep it in the family! That would have fit better in part 2, but he took too long to give me the setup. Like, come on, cut me some slack.
So if you have a cat, it's going to create more cats. If you have a dog, it's going to create more dogs. There are limitations to what mutations can do.
I mean, yeah, there's probably never going to be a mutation that allows an organism to survive in the center of the sun, but that's not the kind of limit that Matt's talking about here, is it? Honestly, I've never understood this argument. Like, all animals share a certain amount of genetic material, but even if they didn't, the genetic code itself is universal. Which means that if you take the genome of any organism on the planet, you could turn it into the genome of any other organism on the planet through a series of relatively simple changes. Sure, it might take you a while to get you there, and if we're talking about a person at a computer just typing A's, C's, G's, and T's, they will inevitably wind up making changes that wouldn't actually be likely in a real reproductive scenario, but the fact remains that, working one letter at a time, the genome of one organism could be turned into any other organism's genome, and I've never seen a creationist explain where the barrier is or why it exists. They seem to rely entirely on the incredulity of the audience to make their point.
Mutations can only cause us to devolve over time and not evolve.
Citation needed, motherfucker!
And this is why evolution is not true. It is not part of science. Because if you look at the human genome, you're going to find that there's more mutations in the offspring than in the parent.
Yeah, that's how accumulation works, Matt. Remember accumulation? We learned about it again in video 1, but this one actually combines with a thing called purifying selection in order to purge the deleterious mutations. So the deleterious mutations go away over time, while the neutral and positive ones build up over time. The building up of neutral ones is actually important as well, as they provide the scaffolding on which a future positive mutation can be built.
That means that mutations are accumulating, mutations cause us to die, and mutations will eventually cause us to become extinct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you believe in that whole end times thing where Jesus comes back and causes our extinction with his mouth sword thing? What kind of mutation did Jesus end up with that gave him a sword in his mouth? Was it related to the one that gives Canada geese teeth on their tongues? Because that actually makes a little bit of sense.
If the Lord doesn't come back and save us before then, which he promises to do.
Oh, okay, I see. You do believe that. You just think that mutations might get us first, even though Jesus promised to do his sword mouth thing first? Weird that you don't trust him to keep his promise, but you do you, I guess.
Check this out. It says, turns out all of humanity is related to a single couple.
This is that mitochondrial Eve nonsense, I swear to fuck.
A new study reveals that all humans are descendants of the same man and woman.
Oh, it's even worse than the mitochondrial Eve nonsense. We're like 4 levels deep in the telephone game at this point. For classic Powell fans, this might be a familiar one. This is the one where, in Science Falsely So Called, Matt misunderstood an article on Tech Times that misunderstood the study. Well, that wasn't deep enough apparently, so now we've got Matt misunderstanding a New York Times article that misunderstood a Tech Times article that misunderstood the study. As a quick recap, this study looked at the mitochondrial DNA of about 100,000 animal species and found that 90% of them experienced mitochondrial uniformity sometime between 1 and 200,000 years ago. Their conclusion was, essentially, that this means that the average lifespan of a species as a whole is about 1 to 200,000 years. Honestly, if this weren't a surprising conclusion, this would have just been a normal paper doing normal science stuff. In this case, they set out to determine if mitochondrial DNA is even useful when defining species. Like, the paper is literally called, "Why Should Mitochondria Define Species?" But the news outlets saw the sentence, "The extant population, no matter what its current size or similarity to fossils of any age, has expanded from mitochondrial uniformity within the past 200,000 years," and ran with, "Some big event wiped out most life 200,000 years ago." despite that not actually being even close to what the paper said. The reporting on this one was so bad that the authors felt the need to add a clarifying note to the top of the paper, so now when anyone goes back to the original, which sadly doesn't happen anywhere near as often as it should, the first thing they'll see is, "This study is grounded in and strongly supports Darwinian evolution, including the understanding that all life has evolved from a common biological origin over several billion years. This work follows mainstream views of human evolution. We do not propose that there was a single Adam or Eve. We do not propose any catastrophic events." So, yeah, when that's the first thing that you see when you look up the actual paper that is being cited to support a single human couple, then it's safe to say there was a miscommunication somewhere down the line. And given how sheepishly Matt is brushing past this one when it used to be what he called his trump card,
I'm going to pull out my trump card now. So Tech Times just came out with this article.
I'm gonna say that he knows how bad of an argument this is, and is just using it as padding and hoping that I won't notice it and call him out on it.
In Biology for Majors, it states that a mutation is a change that occurs in our DNA sequence due to mistakes when the DNA is copied.
Yes, that is what a mutation is. Do you think that just because they use the word mistake, that means that all mutations are always bad all the time? Have you never seen Bob Ross paint anything?
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Evolution is a huge Bob Ross fan. The whole damn thing is a series of happy accidents.
Mutations can occur during DNA replication if errors are made and not corrected in time. Mutations can also disrupt normal gene activity and cause diseases, like cancer. Cancer is the most common human genetic disease. It is caused by mutations.
And in a surprise to nobody, he's completely skipped past all mention of any beneficial mutations, including the sentence right at the beginning that says, "This can be a bad or a good thing." Honestly, this particular textbook sounds like it's written for someone in grade 6. I actually had to double check and make sure it really is a university level textbook, and surprisingly it is. Like, yes, nobody is denying that mutations are caused by mistakes or errors during the replication process. That's literally exactly what they are. Yes, those words do have negative associations for most people, but no, that does not mean that mutations are always bad, as was explained in several places on the page that you are showing, which you had to actively cut around in order to avoid showing.
Mutations will not turn you from a frog to a prince over millions of years.
No, but that's mainly because our last common ancestor with frogs was probably one of the first tetrapods, which lived about 400 million years ago. Basal frogs didn't evolve until about 250 million years ago, so frogs are not in our ancestral lineage. But that's taking that statement more seriously than it deserves. The appropriate response to that is, what a dumb thing to say.
Mutations actually cause us to devolve.
Except when they don't. Which is all the time, actually, because devolving isn't actually a thing. Like, yeah, that one episode of Star Trek where Janeway and Paris had little lizard reptile baby things together because he broke the warp 10 barrier.
I don't know how I'm going to enter this into the log.
That's not real, Matt. That was a TV show. De-evolution or devolving isn't a thing.
In science, we're actually devolving. We're not evolving.
Citation fucking needed.
Our genetics are becoming worse, not better. The second law of thermodynamics is true.
Yeah, the second law of thermodynamics is true, but it's not applicable here. It applies in an isolated system. An isolated system is one that does not exchange matter or energy with its surroundings. A closed system can exchange energy, but not matter, and an open system exchanges both. The second law of thermodynamics, simplified, is that in an isolated system, entropy will increase over time. An isolated system, remember, is one which cannot exchange energy or matter with its surroundings. Now, Matt, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's a big-ass fucking ball of fire in the sky that constantly provides us with a shit ton of energy. Which means that by definition, the Earth is not an isolated system. Although, given the air and space comment, I'm not even sure if I should mention that it's a big ball of fire. It's plasma that's like fusing hydrogen into helium. It's not actually like fire. It's not burning like fire. The air in space is not different from the air well, I mean, I guess it is technically. I'm off track. This is actually off track. In the video that I made fun of myself for scripting my off-track things, I am actually off track now. So, yay, progress? Anyway, back to the Earth. So, there's also the fact that, like a stream flowing down a mountain, carving its channel deeper and thus allowing more water to flow through it more efficiently, the evolution of complex systems that increase entropy faster than it would without their presence is actually a prediction of the second law of thermodynamics. Life is almost literally the universe's way of turning sunlight into poop with maximum efficiency.
That everything is tending towards chaos and not order.
Order and chaos are oversimplified colloquial terms that can help a high school student get a basic grasp on what entropy is, but entropy is actually a measurement of how many states it's possible for a system to have. The easiest example of this would be an isolated system of gas molecules. When you first set up the system, if there are concentrations of molecules, those molecules will eventually spread out and equalize across the whole system. When there is no concentration and the gases are uniformly spread out, there are more states that the system can be in that won't change anything about the system than in one where the gases are concentrated in various places in the system. So really, in a neat little plot twist, you could say that a system with maximum entropy is actually much less chaotic than a low entropy system. A universe that is nothing but a perfectly uniform cloud of hydrogen gas is way less chaotic than the one we have now, with giant space rocks hurling all over the place, smacking into each other, but it also has way more entropy than ours.
Mutations are a result of human sin.
So, that time I sucked a dick mutated my DNA? Oh shit, I figured it out! The way we get real-life X-Men is with a bunch of gay orgies! Nice!
And suffering is a result of our wrong decisions in life.
Yeah, it's the baby's fault it got cancer, obviously.
The Bible says, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned."
Okay, Matt, you might want to work on your reading comprehension, because that doesn't say anything about mutations. It's about death. And not only that, it appears to be getting the mythology wrong. In Genesis, it's quite clear that the way Adam and Eve would have avoided death had they not sinned was through their access to the tree of life, the tree that, according to Genesis 3:22, is what would have granted eternal life to those who eat its fruit. That's actually explicitly why they had to be kicked out of Eden. Someone who had the knowledge of good and evil and lives forever is a god. Eating the tree that gave them the knowledge of good and evil got them halfway there, so to stop them from becoming gods, they had to be denied access to the tree of life. So it's not so much that death entered the world through their sin, it was that the permanent prevention of death was denied to the world because of their sin.
In creation science, we believe that the world is 6,000 years old.
And yet, the study that you indirectly referenced earlier, in order to make the claim that Adam and Eve were real, would have had them living hundreds of thousands of years ago. And the science that got them to that time frame was the same science that got the Adam and Eve conclusion. Well, actually it wasn't, because the Adam and Eve thing wasn't a conclusion of the study. That was just something that the press ran with for clicks. But if we pretend it was in the study, then if the study were flawed enough to conclude that the things happened on a timescale that was off by 2 orders of magnitude, then it's flawed enough that we can't rely on any of its conclusions. So either the study was reliable and the Earth has to be at least a couple 100,000 years old, but realistically much older, or it was unreliable and thus cannot be used to draw any conclusions. But such is the nature of creationism. They must pick and choose what data to pay attention to, because the picture painted by looking at all the data is one that they cannot tolerate.
But in evolution, they believe that the world is 13.7 billion years old.
This might seem like a minor nitpick, but you should probably differentiate between the potential meanings of the word world. In this case, it seems to be meaning universe, but generally world would be used to refer specifically to the Earth, which is a mere child of 4.5 billion years old. I get that in creationism, the Earth was made first and then the rest of the universe was created around it a couple days later, so you have to pretend like the two are interchangeable in order to avoid the obvious absurdity of the way the Bible says that God did it, but that doesn't really fly.
And there are many indicators in nature that show us that the Earth is not billions of years old.
Ooh, are we gonna get the moon as a clock thing? Please do that. It's just hilariously wrong. Sadly, he did not ever do the moon clock thing.
And one of those things is diamonds.
Aww, I wanted the moon clock thing. Like, come on, Matt, do you remember when you used to get up in front of the podium at your church and scream about people drinking Coke and playing video games while talking about how the moon would have crashed into the Earth in the past?
They can't think for themselves. They sit back and they drink Coke all day and sit behind a video game system and then wonder why, you're crazy, Brother Powell, for believing in a creator. Oh, you're insane. No, you're crazy, and you need to get off the video game system, and somebody needs to preach to them the gospel of Jesus Christ, and so that they can be saved. That's what we need. And I'm sick and tired of these stinking video games.
You were way more interesting back then. This is like you've been taking speech lessons from Grady McMurtry, which is like the most boring guy I've ever listened to. It's like, just come on, spice it up a bit. For me, for your old pal Rhino, please.
Diamonds are made up of the most compact atomic particles in the world.
See, now here we go, back to the word world. You are now clearly referring to the Earth with the word world, because I'd imagine that the atomic particles in a neutron star are quite a bit more compact than those in diamonds. Though most compact isn't exactly a scientific term, so it's hard to say for certain, but if I assume that he means the material with the highest density, then that's actually not even true of the Earth. The densest known material on Earth is osmium. Well, that's the densest stable, naturally occurring material at least. I'm pretty sure he probably meant hardest, as that's the diamond's main claim to fame. But again, he needs to specify Earth here, as there are substances in the universe that are likely significantly harder than diamonds, like nuclear pasta, winner of the best named object in astrophysics, especially because the pasta theme carries on to its different forms, giving us nuclear gnocchi, nuclear spaghetti, nuclear lasagna, and others. It's likely the hardest material in the universe. This is why being both specific and careful with your words is important, Matt.
And even with all of our best technology, we have a hard time being able to break through them.
Yeah, that's true. It is known to be impossible to cut diamonds. That's why all diamond jewelry just includes diamonds in their natural state. It's not like there are, names for the various ways a diamond can be cut when used in jewelry, right? Come on, man. Even your previous only read the first Google result style research would have given you the answer here. Like, yeah, it took us about 1,000 years to figure out how to cut a diamond, but we've been doing it since at least the 1300s.
Well, diamonds contain C14.
Diamonds are made of carbon, which means that they would have contained C14 at their initial formation. They are also found buried in the ground, which we established in a previous installment of the series exposes them to radiation from uranium decay. The C14 in a diamond would have long ago decayed into nitrogen, which would remain trapped inside the diamond. Nitrogen impurities are a regular thing in diamonds. Upon exposure to radiation, nitrogen can be converted back into carbon-14. The carbon-14 in our atmosphere actually exists because of the process that does that. Nitrogen in the atmosphere gets hit by cosmic rays, which converts it to carbon-14. So, surround a diamond with slightly radioactive material, and you're bound to get at least a handful of nitrogen atoms converted into carbon-14 through its interaction with radiation. Easy peasy.
Now remember, C14 only lasts for 50,000 years. And so, if C14 is in diamonds, and C14 is constantly exiting diamonds, why is it still in there?
Because it's not exiting the diamond, Matt. It remains within it as nitrogen, which has the potential to turn back into carbon-14. But also, the most prominent time a creationist tried to carbon date diamonds, they had to modify the carbon dating process, because diamonds are not combustible, and even with their modified process, they obtained carbon levels that were within the typical margin of error for AMS carbon-14 detection, which effectively means that they didn't find any carbon-14. So, yeah.
If you Google how old are diamonds, it will tell you that they're between 1 and 3.5 billion years old.
Oh, god damn it. We're back to glancing at the first result of a Google search? Fuck off with your lazy-ass research, Matt. Okay, Google your friend Tommy McMurtry. You know what the first result will be? It's gonna be a website saying that we don't actually know whether or not he's attracted to pumpkins sexually.
One of the other things that we find consistently is helium inside of rock crystals. Now, these helium bubbles are actually slipping out of the rocks over time. They're very unstable.
Unstable, when talking about elements, usually refers to their half-life. Helium is perfectly stable in this sense, but yes, it does slowly travel upwards through the Earth's crust. It can get caught in natural gas pockets where it will essentially stay until we drill it out. But because of how slowly it's produced, it is a finite resource that we will run out of eventually.
And so, why is it that certain rock crystals are loaded with helium?
Well, there are numerous problems with the research that came to that conclusion, which was part of the same research that found the carbon-14 in diamonds. They made mathematical errors, ignored data that didn't fit their conclusions, didn't account for the possibility of excess helium, a huge problem as helium is known to permeate through zircon crystals and get stuck in the lattice, a tiny number of samples used to draw sweeping conclusions, a requirement for the decay rates to have been sped up to the point that enough heat would have been generated during the speed up to vaporize the entire Earth, and more. Like, seriously, that is just a tiny sliver of the problems with the excess helium claim. There is a whole 50,000-word essay pointing out way more than that by geochemist Dr. Kevin Henke. That is basically a short novel that is completely about the things that the guys who found too much helium in the rocks got wrong. So, yeah, there are reasons why there would be too much helium in a zircon, but none of those reasons were adequately accounted for by the RAPE project, so the results are sketchy, to say the least.
And you can even go to different places and see the bubbles in these rocks.
Okay, but like, even if I assume that those bubbles you're showing are actually helium bubbles and not like literally any of a bunch of different things that can make bubbles in crystals, seeing a bubble does not actually mean that there's more helium there than could otherwise be accounted for. It just means that there is currently a helium bubble in the crystal. Without a more thorough examination, that's literally it.
If these rocks are millions of years old, there wouldn't be any helium left inside of them.
That's not even a little bit true. Helium is one of the byproducts of uranium and thorium decay. It happens slowly, but it does still happen. Every time a radioactive element decays through alpha decay, a new helium atom is born, though it's ejected from the parent at about 5% the speed of light, causing it to strip a bunch of atoms of their electrons as it crashes through them before finally settling down to inert helium. So no, we don't expect all helium to be gone in samples that are billions of years old. Quite the contrary, we would expect to find very little helium in samples of only a few thousand years old, with older samples containing more helium, to a point.
And so that means that they also were created recently.
No, it doesn't. It just means that you're an idiot.
But if you Google how old are crystals, they say that it's supposedly the oldest scrap of Earth's crust.
Jesus fucking Christ, Matt, come on! Not all crystals are the same goddamn age! Like, fuck, man, I have grown crystals from those science project kits that you get for kids. Those are crystals in the exact same way that zircons are crystals. It's just a different kind of crystal. Hell, I still have the bismuth crystals that I grew back in April just so I could joke about farting bismuth into existence. These crystals are only 5 months old. I guarantee you there are crystals that are older than that because, you know, that's how time works. So yeah, Google wouldn't know about my 5-month-old crystals when you ask how old are crystals. Honestly, if you told me that this part of the video is just included as a cover for when his wife found him Googling the age of a porn star named Crystal, I'd believe it. But yeah, the oldest terrestrial zircon crystal we found is about 4.4 billion years old. No word on how much helium was in that particular sample, so I'm not sure why it's even relevant here, but sure, we found a 4.4 billion year old zircon crystal. Therefore, the Earth is 6,000 years old, obviously.
And even if we look in outer space, we can see evidence of a recent creation as well.
No, outer space is really the worst place to go for that, given that just the fact that we can see as much as we can means that the light from those stars that we see has to have been traveling for longer than you believe the universe existed for.
Because short period comets, for example, only last 10,000 years. They're actually burning up. If you look at the tail of a comet, what that actually is material that's getting blown off of the comet. It's literally breaking down and disintegrating over time. And the question then becomes, could these comets be millions of years old?
To quote Answers in Genesis, when far from the sun, the nucleus of a comet is at sufficiently low temperature for the ice to remain frozen, and thus the nucleus can exist indefinitely in this state. And that's from an article originally published in 1997, where the main complaint was that creationist arguments relying on comets to prove a young solar system were 25 years out of date. Now, in that article, they don't advocate for abandoning comets as evidence for a young Earth, but they do have to question the existence of the Kuiper Belt in order to maintain the argument, and they do so by questioning the legitimacy of the first ever images of Kuiper Belt objects to come from Hubble, while paradoxically acknowledging the discovery of around 36 Kuiper Belt objects that they point out are definitely real, but somehow finding objects that fit the predictions observations of the Kuiper Belt model in locations where the Kuiper Belt would be don't count as finding and observing the Kuiper Belt? Well, since then, several surveys have been done of Kuiper Belt objects, with several hundred more objects being catalogued. The Kuiper Belt is where short-period comets come from. As Answers in Genesis pointed out, there is no limit on how long a comet can last when it's that far away from the sun. So until a gravitational interaction knocks a Kuiper Belt object into an orbit that takes it into the inner solar system, they can just hang out there forever. Meaning that even if your 10,000-year upper limit for a comet's age is correct, that countdown would only begin when the comet is knocked into the inner solar system. So yes, those comets could indeed be millions of years old.
The answer is no.
Not according to Answers in Genesis. To quote the same author of the 1997 article, but writing in 2012, given the loss rates, it's easy to compute a maximum age for comets. That maximum age is only a few million years. And honestly, that article is even worse than the 1997 article when it comes to ignoring the Kuiper Belt. It ends with a paragraph that basically says, yeah, we found a bunch of Kuiper Belt objects, but we only found the big ones that are the easiest to find, and they're bigger than comets, so obviously it still doesn't exist. And with regards to the even more distant Oort cloud, they just completely dismiss it by saying there is no evidence for it and likely never will be. Except we've discovered at least 2 objects that are too far out to be in the Kuiper Belt, and thus have been categorized as inner Oort cloud objects. So unless you call direct observation no evidence, he's just wrong. And the reason we've seen so few of them is because these objects are relatively small and not very reflective. It's basically impossible for us to see them with our current imaging technology. This leaves us with a choice. We can either believe that icy rocks exist, which models of solar system formation that rely on an application of the laws of physics suggest should exist, or that the existence of icy rocks that are predicted by an application of the laws of physics are just scientists trying to salvage old ages for the Earth, and it was actually an all-powerful sorcerer that broke all the laws of physics when he created everything 6,000 years ago. So, to reiterate, it's either icy rocks, a type of thing that has been conclusively demonstrated to exist, might also exist in places that are farther away than we can see, or magic.
When a comet goes through its orbit, many times it will orbit the sun, and when it gets close to the sun, it burns up 3 to 5%. It can only lose so much before it's lost at all, right?
Sure. I mean, the ultimate fate of spent comets is a matter of some debate. They could either just completely disintegrate, or as the volatile portions of the comet sublimate, the stable rocky portions remain, building up to form a crust that protects the interior from further sublimation, leaving behind small-ish rocks with potentially still somewhat icy cores that look like asteroids. But most likely, it's a bit of both. The question is more about what process is dominant. But that's beside the point. Matt is just getting at the fact that comets don't last forever, but we still have comets. Therefore, magic. This kinda plays into his difficulty in comprehending accumulation in part 1. This time, there's a snowbank, but every time the sun shines, it gets a little smaller. So why is it still there after months of winter weather, much of which was sunny? Because, Matt, the snowbank is where I throw snow from my driveway when I shovel it. And it keeps snowing on my driveway, so there's a constant replenishing of snow for me to throw on the snowbank.
And since evolutionists believe that the universe has been around for billions of years, they have to explain why comets still exist.
Yeah, and it's because far away from the sun, where it is far too cold to sublimate the various forms of ice that can be found out there, the various forms of ice can be found out there. And sometimes they bump into each other, or get close enough for their gravity to alter each other's orbits, and as a result, they get flung into the inner solar system. It's not that complicated, Matt.
And so what they will say is that there is this thing called the Oort cloud that's constantly creating new comets and spiraling them into orbit.
Well, you brought up short-period comets earlier. Those guys come from the Kuiper Belt. The Oort cloud is where the long-period comets come from, and it's not so much creating them and flinging them into the inner solar system, as it is just the primordial leftovers of the formation of the solar system that have been hanging out there since the beginning, which occasionally do get knocked into closer orbits.
But if you were to Google, is there any evidence that the Oort cloud exists? The answer is that there is no definitive evidence that the Oort cloud exists. It says for decades, scientists have theorized that beyond the edge of the solar system, there lies a massive cloud of icy planetesimals known as the Oort cloud. This cloud is believed to be where comets originate from. However, no evidence has been provided to confirm the Oort cloud's existence.
First off, this may just be a difference in how Google's algorithm shows things to me versus how it shows them to Matt, but that article was buried in the second page of my Google results for that exact search. So it seems that Matt has now gone from only reading the first result of a Google search to digging deep into the results to find that one article that says what he needs it to say. But that brings me to my next point here. This article doesn't say what Matt is saying it says. I've noticed slight differences between Matt's quote of an article and the actual article before, and I hadn't thought much of it because sometimes articles get updated and the differences have never really been significant. But in this case, I found a few, shall we say, incongruities that I would like to discuss. Ordinarily, Matt is perfectly happy to display the headline of whatever article he's quoting, but in this case, he doesn't. Likely because the headline of this article makes it quite clear that it doesn't actually support Matt's conclusions. It's called, "Oort clouds around other stars should be visible in the cosmic microwave background." This article is about how our Oort cloud is nearly impossible to directly detect, but indications of the presence of Oort clouds around other stars may be easier to detect than our own by looking for signatures in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Okay, but that's just normal Powell dishonesty. We've seen that he's comfortable pulling from sites like Talk Origins when they have an introductory paragraph phrased in a way that seems to make the creationist argument make a little bit of sense, and Talk Origins definitely doesn't support any of his conclusions. So hiding a headline isn't exactly shocking behavior from Matt, but what I'm beginning to suspect here is that he's actually modifying the text before taking his screenshots. The actual quote from this site is, "However, to date, no direct evidence has been provided to confirm the Oort cloud's existence." And just to show how easy it is to edit text on a website for a fake screenshot, I spent about 15 seconds changing the headline to "Matt Powell is a poopy-faced liar." And the majority of that time was spent typing "Matt Powell is a poopy-faced liar" rather than anything technical. Literally all you have to do is right-click the text you want to change, click Inspect, possibly expand the section containing the text, as I had to here, double-click, and type away. This is actually the same method that some scammers use to make people think they got too big of a deposit into their bank account. After they've gained remote access to your PC, they'll have you log into your bank and then black out the screen for a few seconds while they add a few lines of code to make it look like there's a new deposit there, and when your screen comes back, you can see that there are too many zeros. They usually then plead with you to please mail them gift cards of some kind, because if you pay them back through normal methods, the mistake will be found out by their boss and they'll be fired. That's my PSA for this episode. Let your family members know about this method, especially if they're elderly and not technically inclined. Back to Matt. I suspect that he did this before taking his screenshots in order to take out the bit about how there has been no direct evidence, thus making it sound like it's just scientists spitballing ideas without any evidence, rather than scientists concluding that the Oort cloud exists based on extensive modeling and simulations. Now, back to what the article is actually talking about. Since the study being featured in the article was published, their method has been used to look for Oort clouds around other stars, and it has been found that about 10% of K and M type stars within 80 parsecs show signs of having Oort clouds. So now we go from there are probably icy chunks of rock in massive orbits around the solar system, because it makes sense and the modeling suggests that, to we have data that points to a significant number of stars having these clouds, so there being one around ours is definitely not out of the question. And I'd like to thank Matt for his dishonesty here, because without it, I wouldn't have found out about this research. At least not yet. I probably would have come across it at some point in the future, but Matt gets the credit for it now.
The Oort cloud is completely made up. It's a rescue device that tries to answer the obvious fact that comets exist in our solar system and in the world, and they don't know how to deal with it. So the only thing they can do is make up or make believe a rescue device.
Well, this made-up and make-believe rescue device has a bunch of math and physics backing it up, as well as probable observation of similar things existing around other stars. So rather than just misquoting the introduction of a news article that talks about the initial proposition of the method that has been used to detect Oort clouds around other stars, you're going to need to bring some pretty heavy-duty mathematical modeling of your own to the table before you just get to dismiss it. And again, even if there were no direct evidence of the Oort cloud, we still wind up at a choice between things that we know also exist farther away than we can see, or magic. There's nothing particularly special about a ball of ice existing somewhere cold, but you need to ignore all the evidence that points to this very mundane thing existing in order to pretend like magic is the more viable option here.
Science is based on what we know and what we can see.
No, science is based on the formulation and testing of hypotheses to rule out as many explanations as possible until you're left with the most plausible explanation. With most things, when you get to the specifics, there will always be room for another explanation to take over as more plausible, but the explanation that Matt is proposing is literally magic. It is completely unfalsifiable and therefore impossible to rule out, thus making it scientifically useless. Matt is proposing that because we have not visually detected the Oort cloud around our own solar system, it must therefore not exist. That is just as bad an argument as the Christian straw man of the atheist position that says that atheists think that God doesn't exist just because we can't see him, which they always follow up by pointing out that air exists but isn't usually visible. Atheists believe in air, don't they? Wait, we're talking about space. We probably shouldn't bring up air. Matt might get confused about the air in space.
But in space, wouldn't it be a different scenario based on the fact that, you know, the space and the air in the space is much different than the air we have here?
We can't see the Oort cloud because it probably doesn't exist. It's just something that they made up.
Matt, you get on the case of every science writer who uses any word like probably or believe or something like that because it denotes uncertainty. And yet the best you can do here is say that it probably doesn't exist? What makes you say that? Did you calculate the probability of its existence? Did you take into account the 10% of K and M type stars that probably do have their own Oort clouds when you did your calculations? And, using Matt Powell's methods of textual manipulation, I actually found this article which points out that we have directly observed every single Oort cloud object that exists, so checkmate Matt. And just a disclaimer, because sometimes people and the YouTube bots don't understand what a joke is. That was a manipulated image. It's not real. Yeah, I have more integrity than that. What can I say?
And even the planets show that the universe was created recently because Saturn's rings are dispersing over time.
Just quickly popping in to remind everyone that according to the 17th century Vatican librarian Leo Alatius, when Jesus was circumcised, his foreskin ascended into the heavens to become the rings of Saturn.
Before long, those rings will have deteriorated, they will have dispersed into non-existence.
Yes, Saturn's rings are dissipating, and are likely only 1 to 400 million years old, which is relatively young in astronomical terms, but is still several orders of magnitude older than you think the universe is.
Pluto is warm on the inside.
Fun fact, the temperature of Pluto's interior has never been directly measured. It has been determined based on that mathematical modeling thing that Matt seems to think constituted no evidence when talking about the Oort cloud. But yes, Pluto is thought to have a relatively hot core, which might even be mostly iron, which keeps its subsurface ocean liquid, allowing for the formation of new ice that can work its way to the surface, thus explaining the observations of the New Horizons probe.
Could that be the case for millions of years?
Yes. Big things take a long time to cool off, especially when well insulated and kept warm through radioactive decay.
Could you put a cup of coffee, right, and have steam coming off of it for millions and millions of years, and it remain at a certain temperature for deep time?
Not by itself, no, but Matt, do you not realize that a bigger cup of coffee, if it begins at the same temperature as the smaller cup of coffee, will take longer to cool off than the small cup? Surely Pluto's interior is just a bit bigger than your cup of coffee there. Like, just a little bit. Just a smidge.
I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, well, what else would we expect from you at this point?
There is no way that this could have been the case. Obviously, these planets were created recently.
Matt, planets are bigger than cups of coffee. Also, I know I'll get some hate for this, but Pluto is a dwarf planet, not a planet. Still way bigger than your average coffee mug, but not a planet. F's in the chat for Pluto.
And one thing that I've always seen evolutionists use to try to say that the universe is billions of years old is radiometric dating.
Yeah, that is a good one. There are several dating methods that wouldn't even work on samples that are younger than several million years old, so the fact that they do work means that the world has to be at least several million years old.
Now, a couple things to note. Radiometric dating has never been correct.
In 1949, when carbon dating was first developed, the initial testing was done on samples whose ages were known through non-radiometric dating methods, and the results were reasonably accurate for a new method that was being developed. Though, as time went on, it became apparent that the assumption of constant carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere was inaccurate, and so scientists began using calibration curves. Using tree rings, they would measure the change in C14 levels throughout the life of the tree, and use these measurements to calibrate their dates, thus drastically improving the accuracy of the dating method. Uranium series dating is one of the most accurate dating methods we have, with error margins regularly being around 0.1%. Rubidium-strontium dating can get you to about 0.1 to 0.2% accuracy, with the added bonus of there being a stable isotope of strontium that is not the product of any radiometric decay chain, which can be used to detect any contamination or loss of the isotopes used for dating in the sample, meaning that, contrary to the creationist complaint to the contrary, sure, why not? It works. We can actually figure out exactly how much of each isotope was present in the rock when it formed, and can know whether or not any excess isotopes were included at any point, or whether any escaped at any point. For more information on that one, I'll direct you to my standalone video on dating methods. My point is that we know how accurate these dating methods are, we know what conditions will alter their accuracies, and we can account for that. Not only that, but samples are often dated with different methods, using isotopes that have different half-lives, or even using one of the many non-radiometric dating methods, such as electron spin resonance dating, in order to make sure the dates match up. If they do not, we know there was an issue with the sample. If they do, then we can be confident in the results, as the contamination or loss of isotopes would have had to have been very exact in order to yield the same results through different methods.
For rocks of known age.
Oh, god damn him and his long pauses. I cut in too early. I wouldn't have brought up carbon dating if I knew he was going to rocks. Okay, this is probably going to be that thing where xenolith inclusions in a lava flow were dated as older than the eruption that produced the flow, which is accurate, because they are. They are literally chunks of rock that did not melt in the lava and ended up included inside the hardened rock once it cools. So yeah, they date older because they are older. But creationists love them because they can say, hey, this rock that came from the Mount St. Helens eruptions in 1980 dates older than 1980. Checkmate atheists!
They've always come back with incorrect dates, and they use circular reasoning. Check this out in World Book Encyclopedia. It says the age of the rocks may be determined by the fossils found in them. Then it says scientists determine when fossils were formed by finding out the age of the rocks in which they lie.
Dude, you gotta say what editions of the encyclopedia you're using. They're not all the same. Also, you've got it backward. Volume 7 comes before Volume 15. But no matter, we can sift through it together. If we read it in context, the one where the age of the rocks may be determined by the fossils found in them is under the paleontology entry, and doesn't actually give a lot in the way of context. It's just saying that geologists can learn about the rocks by what fossils are found in them, both with regards to how old the rock is and what sort of environment it formed in. Which is true, but doesn't give us anything to respond to Matt with. But then we go to Volume 7. This one is from the fossil entry. It's got a whole subsection on dating fossils from which Matt pulled the quote, and because I don't know what version of the encyclopedia he's using, I can't say for certain that he's edited the quote, but I wouldn't put it past him. In the 2003 edition that I'm using, it says, and I'm just going to read through the whole section here, through many years of research, paleontologists have come to understand the order in which most kinds of fossils occur in the geological record. When a fossil species is first discovered, it is usually found along with other species. If paleontologists know the position of the other species in the history of life, they can determine the position of the new species. This type of dating only indicates whether one fossil is older or younger than another fossil. It does not provide a fossil's age in years. Paleontologists determine how old a fossil is by measuring the radioactive isotopes in the rocks that contain the fossil. And then it goes on for a bit describing radiometric dating. So, yeah, I know you're going for the circularity of we use the fossils to date the rocks and the rocks to date the fossils thing, but what it actually works out to be is that we use the rocks to date the rocks, and then we use the rocks to date the fossils, and then we use the fossils of a species with known age ranges to estimate the age of the rocks they are found in, as well as other fossils they are found with, until a more precise dating method can be used. But I guess that's not as catchy for the creationists, so they don't go with that one. Also, it's true, and not circular, and thus not a problem.
So they're dating the fossils by the rocks by the fossils. That's their dating method. It's circular reasoning.
Yeah, there it is. No, it's not circular. You just have to read the sentences around the ones that you quoted for your video in order to understand why. Matt, just ask yourself, if you have to lie as much as you do in order to make creationism look like it stands even the slightest of chances, Then does it really? The answer is no. No, it doesn't.
Right? But in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted.
Oh, okay, here we go. He took a roundabout way to get here, but I knew it was going to end up here eventually.
And it created lava that flowed down the side of the mountain, and that lava solidified into what's known as igneous rock. Well, some creation scientists took different samples of this rock that had solidified 10 years after it solidified, and they sent it to 5 different labs, known as the Geochron laboratories. The Geochron laboratories checked out these rocks and did their radiometric dating tests, and the dates that they came back with completely debunked radiometric dating.
No, they didn't. This was a stunt by Dr. Steve Austin, the guy who studies cold stones, so he's Stone Cold Steve Austin. He sent his samples into one lab, not 5, Geochron labs, who had prominently displayed on their website at the time that they were incapable of dating samples younger than 2 million years old. So naturally, the dates came back all over the place, as they were likely the result of contamination in the actual machines at Geochron labs. If you misuse a tool, it's not going to give you correct results. But also, you got the dates wrong. The oldest sample came back at 2.8 million years old, but you have one listed at 7 million years old. I assume that that's the one that actually came back at 1.7 million years old and you just fucked it up. Also, fun fact, but the paper that Austin published about this is the one that I've brought up a few times in the past as an example of creationist sloppiness. This paper was published in 1996. Actually, that's another example of Matt's sloppiness. Yes, he dated rocks that should have been about 10 years old, but he was dating the lava dome that formed in 1986, not igneous rocks from the 1980 eruption, as Matt said. But back to the general creationist sloppiness, in his paper, he listed other lava flows that were found to contain excess argon. When he lists the measured ages of the samples, for Sunset Crater, he lists 2 samples that were measured at 0.27 plus or minus 0.09 million years, and 0.25 plus or minus 0.15 million years. Problem is, in the paper he got that information from, those numbers are found in the excess argon column of the table, not the age. So it was actually excess argon in the amount of 0.27 plus or minus 0.09 times 10 to the negative 12 moles per gram, and 0.25 plus or minus 0.15 times 10 to the negative 12 moles per gram. And actually, I'm making him look a lot less sloppy than he was. Sunset Crater just happens to be the one that I noticed first, but he copied the whole table wrong. And because creationists will just copy off each other without actually doing any sort of critical examination or verification, this one easy-to-understand mistake of just copying data from the wrong column on a table can now be found in at least 3 other places in creationist circles. One paper presented by Andrew Snelling at the 4th International Conference on Creationism, one article on Answers in Genesis called Radio Dating in Rubble, and another article by Snelling on the Institute for Creation Research website. In Snelling's defense, the last one actually does have an addendum at the end pointing out the error, but it still has the table with the incorrect data in the main body of the article, which is weird given how easy it would be to correct. They don't even list the correct information in the addendum. They just say essentially, whoopsie doodle, data was copied from the wrong column, but that doesn't change anything, so we're not going to bother reading the original paper to find out the correct data. We're just going to leave the incorrect data in. What's extra wild about this is that Snelling doesn't cite Austin as his source for the table. He cites the original paper, but he made the same mistake as Austin, which suggests to me that Snelling didn't actually read the original paper that the data comes from, but wanted to look like he was being more thorough than he actually was. It's the creationist equivalent of just copying and pasting from Wikipedia and then using Wikipedia's sources as your own.
So all of these igneous rocks from the same event when Mount St. Helens erupted that were only about 10 years old were tested, and they all came back with vastly different ages, according to radiometric dating processes.
Yes. As pointed out, the most likely reason was just because of contamination in the lab that was doing the testing. They weren't equipped to date samples younger than 2 million years, and all of the samples save one came back with ages that were less than 2 million years old. That's not a coincidence. And the one that was older than 2 million years? Well, if you read Austin's paper, he seems quite confident that there was no contamination in the samples, and there were no xenoliths or phenocrysts that could have contributed to older ages. But he admits that all the samples were impure and contained some glass. How the fuck he ruled out contamination when his samples were acknowledged to be impure is beyond me. But as to the glass, in Austin's defense, I'm not sure if it was known in the 90s that glass is a common source of excess argon in samples. I suspect it was known, but I'm not going to be hunting down old references just to make Austin look more honest than he is, when a 2011 paper published in Chemical Geology points out that the measured age of a sample could be elevated by less than 0.01 0.001% of glass contamination by weight, and the younger the sample, the larger this effect would be. So whether or not Austin knew this was an issue, which I suspect he did or he wouldn't have mentioned it, but either way, it is entirely plausible that the sample that actually dated as old enough for the lab to be able to date could have returned that result because of Austin's failure to ensure that the samples did not contain glass. And that's even assuming that he was correct in his assessment that xenoliths and phenocrysts would not have been an issue, though he fails to explain in his paper why it isn't an issue. Instead, he just references a paper detailing various inclusions found in Mount St. Helens rock between 1980 and 1983. The paper does not mention argon once and does not include samples from the 1986 dome that Austin was sampling, and pointed out that the most abundant inclusion type is laminated gabbronite, which contains up to 9% interstitial glass. So if we assume that the rock characteristics did not significantly change between 1983 and 1986, as Austin must in order to use his paper to support his conclusion, then the inclusions that he's not worried about contaminating his sample contain up to 9% glass, when it has been shown that less than 0.01% glass contamination can have significant effect on the measured age of the sample. Given this information, I'm actually surprised that his measured ages came back as young as they did. Like, seriously, it seems like every time I do any amount of looking into the Mount St. Helens thing, I wind up finding brand new layers of creationist incompetency. It really is mind-boggling.
This means that radiometric dating is false.
Or, and hear me out on this, it could mean that a guy who can't be arsed to copy data from a table correctly, is sloppy in his sample preparation, sends his samples to labs that tell him up front that they are incapable of accurately dating his samples, and dismisses the idea of contamination based on papers that didn't analyze rock that even existed when his samples were collected, is wrong. And the rest of geologists are right. I, personally, am going to throw my lot in with the ones who aren't so sloppy that a layperson like me can just see it by looking at how they use their sources.
And by the way, you can create radiometric isotopes in a lab, and the next day they date as millions of years old. Brand new isotopes that date as millions of years old.
Like, yeah, we can create radioactive isotopes in the lab. In fact, there are 24 elements on the periodic table that have never been found in nature, and so are dubbed the synthetic elements. And many of them have extremely short half-lives. But it's not like we're sending samples of elements that we created into dating labs to find out when we created them. I'm gonna need you to explain a bit more of this one.
But we're supposed to believe that just because we find some radiometric isotopes in some rocks, therefore we can use that to date how old these rocks are?
Yes. Naturally occurring radioactive isotopes can be used to date rock samples, even though there are synthetic isotopes that decay quickly. Each isotope has its own half-life, and they don't impact each other. So these two concepts are completely separate from each other. If he doesn't actually show a source for this, I'm just going to assume that he's enough of an idiot that when he found out that some synthetic elements decay quickly, they must date to millions of years old, because he doesn't understand that having a different half-life would impact the dating calculation, and now he thinks that's a gotcha.
It's ridiculous.
You can say that again.
Get this, no rock of known age has ever been dated accurately.
And there's a couple reasons for that. First, if it's rock from an eruption that we observe, such as Mount St. Helens, there's no point wasting resources sending samples in for dating because we know the age. But also, the dating methods that are used on igneous rock are often not able to date young samples because not enough of the parent isotopes have had time to decay into the daughter isotopes. But that doesn't stop geologists and geochemists from examining new lava flows in order to learn about potential issues with dating methods. That's actually why there is so much research for creationists to pull from regarding excess argon. They use the research published as scientists are improving their methods in order to call their methods into question. The scientists say, hey, these are some scenarios that will result in there being too much argon in a sample, and here are ways you can detect it in order to avoid it. And creationists here, there's excess argon sometimes, so every version of argon dating has to be thrown out completely.
And as we come to a close here, I want to talk about the most important part of this presentation. We believe as Christians that Jesus is the truth.
Oh shit, is he gonna start getting preachy and thus allowing me to skip the end? That would be so amazing. I'm only about halfway through this segment, and I'm still in catch-up mode from having gone on vacation, so I would just be so chuffed if I could just end it here.
He could not, in fact, end it here.
But Darwinists believe that Darwin had the truth.
No, Well, maybe. I don't know of any scientist, researcher, professor, atheist, or whatever other category of people creationists usually rail against who would actually call themselves a Darwinist. So maybe there is some small group of people out there somewhere who really do worship Darwin the way that creationists pretend that we all do, who really believe that Darwin had the truth. But in reality, Darwin made some groundbreaking discoveries that significantly advanced our knowledge of biology, but none of his writings are the unassailable truth with a capital T. He was just a guy. A brilliant guy, to be sure, but still just a guy. And honestly, as far as scientists who have the biggest impact on my day-to-day life go, Darwin's not even in the top 10. Pasteur makes sure that the milk in my cereal and tea is safe to drink. Maxwell made Wi-Fi possible. The unknown inventor of eyeglasses in the 13th century makes sure I can see clearly. Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain, whose names I'm probably mispronouncing, made transistors possible, which are one of the primary workhorses behind pretty much every electronic device associated with my computer that I need for work. And that is just a small sampling of the big names. Each of them relied on research and inventions that came before them, and each of their contributions would have been useless on their own in a vacuum without other inventions and discoveries that made it possible to integrate their inventions and discoveries into our day-to-day lives. If semiconductor research had stagnated, transistors wouldn't matter. In fact, arguably, the actual inventor of the transistor invented it too early. Semiconductor research and availability was a long way from being ready for the transistor when the Canadian physicist Lilienfeld patented his field effect transistor, small versions of which are necessary in all sorts of electronic devices today. Though, honestly, maybe I shouldn't minimize Darwin's impact, as much medical research would not work if evolution were not true, so being able to live a relatively healthy life in general could be attributed to Darwin, though with the same caveats about his reliance on prior discoveries and the parallel work that other scientists were doing at the time, not to mention all the work that has continued long after his death.
We can compare this as well. We can compare the life of Jesus to Darwin, and we can see who spoke with accuracy and with truth.
Darwin. Hey, shit changes over time. Well, that seems pretty accurate to me. Jesus. Don't wash your hands before eating. It's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, but what comes out. Not accurate. Some basic information on germs would have been nice and could have saved countless lives. So yeah, Darwin wins.
My name is Darwin. Not Darluse.
First off, Darwin admitted this. He says, "Often a cold shudder has run through me, and I have asked myself whether I may have devoted myself to a fantasy."
In context, that was in a letter from Darwin to Charles Lyell. Lyell had originally opposed evolution, but changed his mind when Darwin presented him with his findings. And this letter was Darwin praising Lyell for being willing to change and accept new evidence. That particular sentence was basically Darwin saying that he has such a high regard for Lyell and his work that the fact that he opposed evolution at first made him nervous that he was wrong. Basically, you are so smart that if you thought that I was wrong, I thought there might be something to that. But the next sentence in the letter clinches it. Now, I look at it as morally impossible that investigators of truth like you and Hooker can be wholly wrong, and therefore I feel that I may rest in peace.
Charles Darwin was afraid that he was living in a fantasy.
A fear that was completely assuaged when highly respected scientists looked at his evidence and found it to be sufficient.
But Jesus never said that. He said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." Jesus spoke in absolutes. Darwin said that he was afraid that he was living in fantasy land.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
I'm sorry that you think that being humble is a bad thing, but one person being more assertive than another does not actually make the more assertive person correct. It just makes them more assertive. But aside from that, Jesus also said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me." And, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Statements that seem to be expressing doubt. If any expression of doubt calls the overall truth of their other statements into question in your mind, then should this not call the "I am the way, the truth, and the life" statement into question?
Darwin said, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world.
Yeah, being a product of the 1800s, Darwin wasn't exactly a woke SJW. Now, in context, this is actually talking about how sometimes the closest living relative to another living species seems to be quite distantly related, but others seem closer, and he's extrapolating a trend by which one extant species eventually wins out while its close relatives go extinct. At the point that Matt is quoting, he's using human races as the example and extrapolating based on the behavior he observed where white Europeans go to other locations and displace the people who already live there. His use of the words savage and civilized are unfortunate, but worth noting is that in his extrapolation, he pictures a race of humans that are even more civilized than the Caucasians that were around in his day, so that is a notable departure from the assumed white supremacy of the time. White isn't as good as it can be. It could be better, more civilized. But yeah, he does immediately compare black people to gorillas at that point, so when it comes to racism, Darwin wasn't as racist as most Europeans of the time, as is evidenced by his description of slavery as a cruelty and his being shocked when he gesticulated in the direction of a slave while being frustrated, and immediately the big powerful man who could easily have beat the snot out of Darwin dropped his arm so that he wouldn't even be showing the appearance of defending himself against physical assault. But if someone were to express the views that he had today, they would be considered problematic to say the least. But even though in his view it was inevitable that Europeans would drive all native populations to extinction eventually, he didn't see this as a good thing. To quote an excerpt from Voyages of the Adventure and Beagle regarding the forced removal of Aboriginals from the island of Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, quote, "All the Aborigines have been removed to an island in Bass's Strait, so that Van Diemen's Land enjoys the great advantage of being free from a native population. This most cruel step seems to have been quite unavoidable, as the only means of stopping a fearful succession of robberies, burnings, and murders committed by the blacks, but which sooner or later must have ended in their utter destruction. I fear there is no doubt that this train of evil and its consequences originated in the infamous conduct of some of our countrymen." So, less than politically correct language aside, Darwin was not endorsing or proposing genocide. He didn't like the idea of white people subjugating and displacing native populations everywhere they went. He just acknowledged that that's what they were doing. Also, I find it very amusing that Matt, who is almost certainly against what he would call cancel culture, is now trying to cancel Darwin for his racist language.
Darwin was a racist.
Pretty much everyone in 1800s Europe was. Call me when you find something shocking.
But Jesus was not a racist.
"And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.' But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she is crying out after us.' He answered, 'I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.' But she came and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, help me.' And he answered, 'It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.'" Matthew 15:21-28. Seems like Jesus didn't think too highly of Canaanites, calling them dogs and saying that doing anything good for them is the equivalent of taking bread from a child and giving it to the dogs instead. Now, sure, he did eventually heal the woman's child, but that doesn't change the fact that he was overtly racist against the Canaanites in this story.
But if you're out in public long enough, you're going to see these bumper stickers. People will say, "My Darwin shark ate your Jesus fish." And they'll have a Darwin fish eating the Jesus fish. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say that Darwin was smart and Jesus was not.
I don't think that's quite it. It's more that evolution and young Earth creationism are completely incompatible, and evolution has a shit ton of evidence backing it up, while creationism has a handful of charlatans who copy each other's sloppy work. There's a sloppy seconds joke here somewhere, but I just can't get it in.
But I have news for them. Darwin said this: "A married man is a poor slave, worse than a Negro."
That was part of a list of pros and cons that he made for getting married, and it came at the end of a list of things that he would never be able to have the time or money to do if he were to get married and start a family. Again, not great wording, but given that he eventually decided that he would very much like to get married, it seems that he determined it wasn't quite comparable.
But in the Bible, the book that God authored, it says this: "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Every single person is precious in the sight of the Lord, whether they're black, white, yellow, red.
Not sure what your point is here, but I would just like to point out that these last two quotes were supposed to be proving the idea that Darwin is smart and Jesus is dumb wrong. And as an example of Jesus not being dumb, he quoted not Jesus. Also, I think he's trying to say that the neither bond nor free part means that God doesn't approve of slavery, but that's not quite what that verse is saying, and given the plethora of verses that explicitly approve of the institution of slavery in the Bible, I'm gonna give this point to Darwin. Yeah, maybe his comparison of a married man to a slave wasn't entirely tactful, but as it was seen as a con in his view, at the very least he knew that slavery was a bad thing. The Bible didn't get that one right, so Darwin wins.
My name is Darwin. Not Darluse.
In Darwin's journal, he admitted this. He said, "I am very stupid, and I hate everybody and everything." That's pretty incriminating to say that you hate everybody and that you hate everything. And people will say, well, maybe he was just undergoing some stress and so he just said that he hates everything. And I've seen people do that. That's fair.
Okay, so Darwin had a bad day, wasn't in a good mood, and honestly, if you actually take this in the context of Darwin's life, he was rather slow about his work compared to other scientists of the time. He saw this as a failing in himself, so he would occasionally become frustrated at how slowly he was plodding along compared to his peers. Also, I don't think it really matters, but that wasn't his journal, that was another letter to Charles Lyell.
But it takes it to a whole nother level when you realize that Darwin wrote this in his journal.
Yeah, never mind. I guess it does matter that it wasn't his journal. Honestly, I feel like it would be less damning in a journal than in a letter. In a private journal, people express things that they might not be comfortable saying to other people. So the fact that he was willing to write that in a letter and send it to a friend is slightly more damning than just expressing it to himself. Though, really all it says is that he had a good relationship with Lyell and trusted him not to take it the wrong way, so it's not really a bad thing.
He actually wrote down how much he hated the world and how much he hated everyone and everything.
Have you never had a day like that, Matt, where things just don't seem to be working out for you and the whole world seems to be against you? That's a pretty normal human experience. But then again, Matt isn't exactly a normal human. Man, if he were an alien in a human suit, that would explain so much. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Christopher Van Oster, who says, "Wait, when you said to smash that like button, there was a little colored animated border on the like button. What did you do to my app, Rhino? Or is this some embedded feature for creators to do that?" Okay, so I'm gonna admit that my cringy intro to last week's video was actually an experiment on my part. I had been noticing that happen on other creators' videos, and I didn't know if that was a feature that was being rolled out that I just didn't have access to yet, or if it was an automatic thing. And I'm happy to report that it was an automatic thing. So don't forget to subscribe for more content that is actually kind of mediocre, if I'm honest, and don't forget to smash that like button. The best part about this is that I won't even know if that worked until after the video is public, so hopefully it worked, but it probably picked up me saying smash that like button in the comment part, so that will probably have been fucked up. Yay! That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Sir Sick Crusader, who says, "Apparently great minds think alike." Or fools seldom differ, as my grandfather would say. We both responded to the exact same Father Casey video on the exact same day with zero coordination, and we both made a bunch of the same observations, but with our own flair. For example, I said that the greatest god ever would give blowjobs on demand. Sir Sick said it'd be soapy handjobs. Anyway, go give his video a watch if you haven't yet, and hide all the new peeps who found me through the algorithm recognizing that we both did the same thing at the same time, and so cross-recommended our videos. I'm not as sweary as Sir Sick and tend to go on long tangents about semi-related science because ADHD hyperfocus is a thing that happens, but yeah, here I am. Do with me as you please, Daddy. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Bill Garrett, who says, "Based on how creepy that was, Cameron is presumably capturing Christianity with a chloroform-soaked rag to the mouth." Perfect comment, no notes. Mwah. That's it for this one. He just spends the last couple minutes preaching, essentially, so I didn't get to end it as soon as I'd hoped, but this is still probably going to be the shortest video in the series. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nigel Skinner 8988, who says, "Jesus did not die for my sins. He basically took an extended nap before doing a bit of pontificating, then going out to buy a pack of cigarettes and disappearing for the rest of eternity." Indeed. Is it really a sacrifice if you wind up exactly where you started at the end of the whole thing? "Jesus had a rough weekend for your sins" is much closer to the truth of the matter. Well, Jesus didn't do anything for your sins is the actual truth of the matter, but you know what I mean. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream Lacerus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Also, if all goes according to plan, I'm going to have Forrest Valkai on an interview on The Watering Hole on Thursday the 12th, so keep your eyes open for that. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Michael T. Seaman, Junior Minty, gross name Junior, come on, Mint is gross. Still be a patron though. And all the rest, who are these small rocks that evolved into the big rock that is my channel. If you'd like to conceive of all life,
who are the helium that escaped from the zircon that is my channel.
If
you'd like to fly through the atmosphere and run away into outer space,
who are the monkeys that surf their way over to the continent that is my channel. If you'd like to be a caricature of a solution to a problem that is shared by both creationists and evolutionists, but more so for creationists, who are the glass that contaminated the rock sample that is my channel. If you'd like to make me look old, honestly, you could just comment about how you've been watching me since you were a kid. Those ones always get me. Or you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! What?
You're so sexy.
Oh, thank you. This is going in the outtakes, by the way.
Oh, you are.
She said that because I'm not wearing pants. In order to make the claim that Adam and Eve. They're cross-referencing the creationist cross-referencing. Apparently that's a hard thing to say. Did that make it wider or tighter?
Tighter.
Tighter? How's that?
No, that made it tighter.
Oh my god. You're the worst DP ever. Hello and welcome to my channel. Apparently I forgot to write Vice Rhino here in the script and I can't say it if it's not there. I don't suppose you could go outside and get me a rock. Preferably not one of the painted ones.
Big, little, what?
Big enough to be obvious that I'm holding a rock on camera.
A few minutes later.
Oh god. Thanks. Oh, this is ridiculous. Doggy! Are you coming to be in the outtakes? You want to be in the outtakes? Let me see. Hi, Doggo. It's been a long time since you've been in the outtakes. Or in the main video. You want to be in the main video? No, I can't. I can't write with you in my arm. Why are you, what? No. Did the rock smell good? Did you like grandmother rock? Yeah, you like grandmother rock. Okay, you go sleepy in your little bed. No, you're all done. You're done being the star. I'm sorry. Don't you wag your tail sadly at me. Do you want me to let you out? Okay, out you go.